Damien Cross did not knock. He never knocked. The door to the small apartment swung open at 6 in the morning, and Elena felt the air change before she even turned around that particular shift in pressure she had learned to recognize over 3 years of marriage, the way a room goes quiet when a storm walks into it. She was standing at the kitchen counter, with her hands around a coffee mug, still wearing yesterday's clothes because she had not slept, and when she turned, he was already inside, already taking up space the way he always did, filling every corner of a room with his presence until there was nothing left for anyone else. "You look terrible," Damien said. He wasn't angry yet. That was the worst part. He said it the way someone comments on the weather flat, observational, faintly disappointed. "Did you even sleep?" Elena set the mug down carefully. Her hands were not shaking. She had promised herself that morning that her hands would not shake. "What are you doing here, Damien?" It wasn't a question. She had stopped asking him questions years ago because questions implied he owed her answers. And Damien Cross did not believe he owed anyone anything. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and picked up her mug and drank from it. Just like that. Just to show her he could. He looked around the apartment, the worn furniture, the water stain on the ceiling, the single suitcase sitting half-packed near the door, and something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Something colder. "You weren't going to say goodbye," he said. "I was leaving a note." A note, he repeated it slowly. The way he repeated things when he wanted her to understand how stupid she sounded. 3 years, Elena. "And you were going to leave me a note." She looked at the suitcase. She had been 40 minutes from walking out the door. 40 minutes. "I want you to leave," she said. Damien smiled. And that smile, she had written about that smile once in a journal she later burned, trying to describe it to herself so she could understand why it frightened her. It wasn't cruel. It didn't look cruel. It looked patient. It looked like a man who had all the time in the world because he already knew how this was going to end. "You're not well," he said quietly. "You haven't been well for a while. I've been worried about you." And there it was. That was the thing he did. That was the thing that had taken her 2 years to name and another year to stop almost believing. Elena picked up her suitcase. Damien's hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, never hard, not where it would mark. Just firm, immovable. A reminder of physics. He was bigger. He was stronger. And he had never once needed to raise his voice to make her feel small. "Put that down," he said. She looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked at his face. And something happened in that moment. Something she would think about for years afterward. Something she could never quite explain, except to say that the fear was still there. It had not gone anywhere. But underneath it, something else had woken up. Something that had been waiting a long time. She pulled her arm free. She walked out the door. If you have ever had to choose between the life you know and the person you are still trying to become, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from. And press the like button. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next at Iron Ridge Ranch will change everything you thought you knew about what a woman is capable of when she has nothing left to lose. The bus station in Chicago smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner, and something underneath both of those things that Elena couldn't name, the particular smell of people who are going somewhere and people who have nowhere left to go, all of them sitting together on the same plastic chairs, all of them pretending not to look at each other. Elena sat with her suitcase between her feet and her mother's mason jar in her lap. The jar was old, the lid slightly dented, and inside it lived a culture of sourdough starter. Her mother had kept going for 11 years before the pneumonia took her. Elena had fed it every week through her entire marriage, through everything Damien had put her through, because it was the one thing in that apartment that was entirely hers, that had come from before him, that would go on after him, that he had never once thought to take away, because he had never understood what it was worth. She didn't have much money. She had cleaned out her personal account, $342, and left everything else because she did not want a single dollar that had come from Damien Cross. She had her clothes, her mother's jar, and the address of a livestock employment bureau that posted job listings for frontier ranch positions in Montana. She had circled one listing 3 days ago with a red pen and memorized the name. Iron Ridge Ranch, cook and domestic worker. Must be willing to work in remote conditions. She had never worked a ranch day in her life. She bought a ticket to Billings, Montana, with a transfer in Minneapolis, and she sat on that bus for 19 hours and 40 minutes while the city fell away behind her, and the land opened up into something she had no language for, wide and pale and indifferent, and so enormous that she pressed her face against the cold window glass and felt, for the first time in years, that she was breathing correctly. Not happy, not safe, not anything she could name yet, but breathing. The connection from Billings to Iron Ridge required a local freight driver named Pete Ackerman, who operated an unofficial passenger service out of the back of his supply truck for anyone traveling the remote ranching routes north of the Yellowstone watershed. He charged $8 cash and did not ask questions, which suited Elena perfectly. Pete was somewhere in his late 50s, with a beard that had gone white at the chin and hands that looked like they'd been used for actual work his entire life. He talked about the weather the way ranching people always talked about the weather, not small talk, but information, the way sailors talk about currents. Specific, serious. You heading to Iron Ridge? He asked, about an hour out of Billings, when the road had become a single lane of frozen gravel running between ridgelines that Elena had no names for. Yes, Maddox's place, that's right. Pete was quiet for a moment. The truck lurched through a rut in the road. You know Cole Maddox? I applied for a position. Cook and domestic. Pete made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Elena waited. She had learned to wait out hums from men. He's not an easy man, Pete said finally. Good rancher. Knows cattle like he was born to it. But he's not easy. I didn't come for easy. Pete looked at her then, a quick sideways look from under the brim of his hat. No, he said, like he was deciding something. I reckon you didn't. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. Elena was grateful for that. Iron Ridge Ranch appeared through the truck window as a collection of dark shapes against a white hillside, the main house. 3 outbuildings, a barn, a long bunkhouse set back from the others. No decorative details, no ornamentation of any kind. Everything about the place said function. Everything said survival. The fence line ran straight, and the gate was practical, and the yard between the buildings had been shoveled but not swept. And there was wood stacked along the south wall of the main house, in a line that told Elena someone here was careful. Someone here planned ahead. Climbed down from the truck with her suitcase before Pete had fully stopped. You want me to wait? He said. No, she said, thank you. He tipped his head and drove away, and Elena stood in the yard with the cold settling into her coat and looked at the main house. The door opened before she could knock. Cole Maddox was not what she had expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. The listing had given her nothing but the ranch name and the job requirements and a post office box address. He was tall, wide through the shoulders, wearing a wool shirt and work pants with mud dried on the knees, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not hostile, but was not welcoming either. It was the expression of a man doing a rapid and unfavorable calculation. He looked at her coat, her shoes, her single suitcase, her hands. You're the applicant, he said, Elena Whitmore. You have any ranch experience? No. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. The listing said cook and domestic, Elena said. I can cook. This isn't a Chicago kitchen, Cole said. He had not asked her where she was from. He had guessed it, or read it off her, and she filed that detail away. He was observant. This man, even if his conclusions were wrong. I know what it isn't, she said. He studied her for another moment. His jaw moved slightly, the way men's jaws move when they're deciding something they'd rather not have to decide. Then he stepped back from the door. Kitchen's around the side, he said. I'll show you where you're working. He did not offer to carry her bag. She did not ask him to. Kitchen was accessed through a separate side door that opened off the main house's back passage. And when Cole pushed it open and stepped aside for her to enter, Elena stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds without moving. The stove was a wood-burning range that someone had last properly serviced sometime before the current decade. One of the top plates had cracked along its length and been repaired with a poured metal patch that had itself begun to separate. The flue pipe where it met the ceiling was wrapped with wire to keep it from pulling loose. The work table along the far wall was solid enough heavy pine, gouged and stained but structurally sound. But the shelving above it had been installed by someone who had either been drunk or simply didn't own a level, and 2 of the 5 shelves sagged so severely at their centers that nothing round could be stored on them without rolling off. One of the 2 windows was sealed with a board instead of glass. There was a mousetrap in the corner, recently triggered, currently empty. The woman who held this position before, Cole said, from behind her, left in October. Elena said. There's a pantry through that door. I haven't taken inventory lately, so I don't know what's still good. She walked to the stove, crouched down and looked at the firebox door, opened it. The grate inside was rusted but not destroyed. She looked at the cracked plate, traced the repair with one finger. "This will need to be reseated," she said. The plate. "I know. The shelves need brackets. The far window needs glass, or at minimum a better seal that board is letting air through along the right side. You can see where the frost has gotten in." She pointed to the wall beside the boarded window, where a thin white line of frost had crept through the gap and crystallized against the interior plaster. "The temperature drops much further, you'll have a split wall." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You seem to know a lot about kitchens that need work." "I've been in a few." He looked at her with that measuring expression again, and she could see him revising something, not his opinion of her. Not yet, but at least the precision of his dismissal. He was an honest man, she thought. Not kind necessarily, but honest. He would admit to himself when he was wrong. He simply had not been wrong yet, from where he was standing. "The hands eat at 6, he said. "Breakfast and supper. Midday they take their own." "How many hands?" 7 currently. "Could go to 9 by spring." "Are there supplies for tonight?" "Check the pantry." "I'm checking." "I'm asking you first because I need to know what we're budgeting before I open the door." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, she wasn't expecting warmth, but a fractional adjustment. The expression of a man who respects efficiency, even when it comes from a source he hasn't decided to respect yet. "Spend what you need for this week," he said. "Keep a record." He left her in the kitchen. She heard his boots on the hall floor, then the main door, then silence. Elena stood alone in that cold, broken kitchen for exactly as long as it took to breathe in and breathe out twice. Then she opened the pantry door. The pantry was not as bad as the kitchen had implied. There were dry goods flour, a 50-pound sack of it, only the top third used, well sealed against moisture. Salt good quantity. Dried beans, several varieties. Cornmeal, a large tin of lard that was past its prime but still usable. 3 strings of dried peppers, hanging from a ceiling nail. Crate of potatoes with about a third beginning to soften, which meant she needed to use those first. Canned tomatoes, 8 tins, no label damage. 2-quart jars of honey, 1 full, 1 1/3 empty. She made a list in her head as she went through it, not on paper yet, in her head first. Because writing things down too early meant you stopped really seeing them and started just reading your own notes. Flour was the thing. Flour was the thing she could work with. She went back to the stove and spent the next 2 hours learning it. Not trying to cook on it yet, just building fires of different sizes and watching where the heat went and where it didn't, watching which spots on the top surface ran hot and which were sluggish, watching the draft, adjusting the damper incrementally and standing back and watching again. Cracked plate was a problem, but a manageable one if she kept heavy pots away from the joint and used the back left quadrant for anything requiring sustained even heat. She had done this before. Not with a stove like this. Not in a kitchen like this. But the principle was the same as anything broken. You don't pretend it isn't broken. You learn what it can do from where it is. By 4 o'clock, she had a pot of bean soup going, using the softest of the potatoes cut small to extend the volume, with 2 dried peppers crumbled in and a good measure of the lard for body. It was not sophisticated. It was not what she wanted to make, but it was what the pantry and the stove and the available time allowed for, and it would be hot and it would fill people, which was the only thing that mattered tonight. She was shaping biscuits at the work table when she heard the side door open. She did not look up immediately. She had the biscuit dough under her hands, and she was in the middle of a fold. "Smells like something," said a voice. She looked up. A man about 30, built like someone who had spent his 20s doing heavy outdoor work, and his early 30s starting to carry the wear of it. Red-faced from cold, with ice crystals still in his eyebrows from whatever he'd been doing outside. He was looking at the pot on the stove with unconcealed interest, and there was something guileless about him that Elena registered immediately. This was not a man who performed anything. He was just a man who was cold and hungry and could smell soup. "Tex Hollis," he said, firsthand. "Elena Whitmore. You the new cook, apparently." He came closer to the stove, holding his hands out to the warmth. "What happened to the shelves?" "They were like that when I got here." "Huh." He looked at the boarded window. "And that?" "Same." He shook his head with the mild philosophical resignation of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by the state of things. "Cole know you're making biscuits?" "Cole told me to feed the hands at 6. "He didn't say biscuits." "No," Elena agreed. "He didn't specify." Tex looked at her, then at the biscuits, then back at her. "Last cook made a kind of corn paste thing for supper. Most nights." That was what it was. "These aren't paste," Elena said. Tex almost smiled. No, he said, I can see that. He went back out through the side door, and Elena heard him say something to someone she couldn't see. And then she heard a second voice answer, and she thought, good. Let them talk. Let them say whatever they're going to say before supper, because after supper she wanted to get the stove temperature dialed in for early morning, and she had to figure out the sourdough starter's state after a day in a cold bag before she could plan tomorrow's bread. She had 100 things to figure out. She had a broken kitchen and 7 strange men and a ranch owner who had looked at her like she was a liability. She shaped the last biscuit and put the pan in the oven and set herself to wait. Supper was not a triumph, it was adequate. The soup was good, she knew it was good, the flavor was right, and the consistency was right. But the biscuits slightly uneven because the oven ran hotter on the left side than she'd accounted for, and the 2 on the far left were darker on the bottom than she wanted. Pulled them out 12 minutes in when she saw the first whiff of smoke from the seam of the oven door, and 3 of the 7 were underdone in the center. Put them on the table anyway. The hands filed in at 6. 7 of them, ranging from Tex Hollis, who was the only one who had looked at her with anything resembling basic courtesy, to a young man named Billy Crane, who looked barely 18 and kept his hat on at the table until the man beside him took it off his head, with 2 fingers, and set it on his knee without a word. There was a man named Hugh, who was the oldest of them, weathered and lean, and he sat at the end of the table and didn't talk to anyone, and ate with the systematic efficiency of someone who thinks of eating as maintenance. There were 4 others whose names she learned only gradually over the course of the meal, because they didn't introduce themselves to her, and she didn't force the issue. Cole sat at the head of the table. He said nothing when the food was brought out. He tasted the soup, set his spoon down, picked up a biscuit, ate. Nobody said it was good, nobody said it was bad. Pot was empty by the time she came back from the pantry, where she'd been taking a second inventory with a candle, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the empty pot and the table where the men were pushing back their chairs and filing out in the same quiet way they'd filed in. Tex paused at the door. Good soup, he said without looking at her. That was all. The door closed. Elena took the pot to the basin and began to scrub it, and she thought, adequate. Today was adequate. Tomorrow she would do better. The issue with the sourdough was that it had been dormant for 19 hours in a cold bag, and a starter that's been cold shocked needs careful handling, not warmth too fast, not too much fresh flour too soon. You had to coax it back. You had to be patient in a way that had no practical upside, except that without the patience you got flat bread that tasted like wet cardboard. Elena set it near the stove at 10 o'clock that night, in the warmest spot she'd found without being in direct heat. Covered it with a piece of cloth she'd found in a drawer clean, meant for straining stock probably, and she let it sit. She fixed the far left shelf while she waited. The issue was a missing bracket on the right side, not rot in the board, which was good news. She found a tin of nails in a box under the work table and an old hand level, and she spent 40 minutes installing a makeshift bracket from a piece of strap iron she found hanging on a nail in the pantry, the kind of thing someone saves not knowing why, which had turned out to have a reason after all. She was on the work table testing the repaired shelf's weight tolerance when she heard the main hall door and then footsteps stop outside the kitchen. Cole opened the door. He looked at her standing on the work table. He looked at the shelf. He said nothing for a moment. Then I was going to fix that, I know, Elena said. Climbed down from the table. I needed the shelf. Came into the kitchen and looked more closely at the bracket work. He didn't touch it. He just looked, the way a man looks at something another person has fixed when he's not sure yet if he'd have done it differently. Where'd you find the iron, he said. Pantry. Hanging on the nail by the second shelf. That was for the fence repair in spring. I used about 4 inches of it. You have 30 left. He looked at her then. She could see him trying to decide what she was, not who she was. That would take longer, but what category of person she occupied. She wasn't what he'd pictured. She clearly wasn't leaving. And she had fixed his shelf without being asked, which was either commendable or irritating, and he hadn't decided which. The boarded window, he said finally. There's glass in the equipment shed, left side. A stack of cut panes from when we replaced the barn windows 2 years ago. One of them should fit. I'll look tomorrow. He nodded once. He left. Elena turned back to her starter. She lifted the cloth and looked at it. Gave it a careful stir with a clean spoon. There were bubbles, small ones. But there, it was alive. She was awake at 4:30. Not because she'd said anything to wake her, There was no alarm clock in the small room off the kitchen where she'd been told to sleep, but because her body had its own sense of what was required, and what was required was bread. She fed the starter at 4:45, folding in a measured amount of flour and water by feel in the dark kitchen lit by a single oil lamp, the stove already going, because she'd banked it carefully the night before and checked it twice before sleeping. By 5:15 she had a dough going, and by 5:30 she had shaped it and left it to proof in the warmth of the stove. She spent the time between 5:30 and 6 in the pantry, doing a proper written inventory, now that she could see by lamplight. She had enough flour for 12 days of serious baking at the volume she was imagining. She had enough of everything else for less than that, which meant she needed to place an order, which meant she needed to talk to Cole Maddox about what the ranch could afford. Was a conversation she was not looking forward to, because she already had a sense that it would not be a comfortable one. She was setting the breakfast table at 6 when the first of the hands came in. It was Hugh, the oldest. He sat in his usual place at the end of the table, put his hat on the bench beside him, and looked at what was on the table eggs from the ranch's own chickens, which she'd found in the small coop she hadn't noticed the day before, scrambled with a bit of salt and a careful amount of the dried peppers, and beside them, a basket of sliced bread. The bread was not perfect. The crust on the bottom was slightly thicker than she wanted, because the oven floor ran hotter than the air temperature implied. Crumb was decent, open and irregular the way good sourdough should be, not the tight, uniform texture of a loaf made with commercial yeast. It smelled right. It smelled like something her mother had made, which meant it smelled like everything she was trying to hold on to. Hugh picked up a slice, looked at it for a moment the way he looked at everything, the same systematic, assessing gaze, put it in his mouth, ate it, reached for another slice. He never said anything, but he reached for that second slice before he'd finished the first, and Elena, standing in the kitchen doorway with a cloth in her hands, watched that small motion and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. The other men filed in. Billy Crane sat down and stared at the bread basket the way young men stare at food when they're trying not to seem too eager. Tex Hollis said, Is that sourdough?" in a voice that was startled and oddly reverent. One of the unnamed hands she would learn later, his name was Dale. A taciturn man in his 40s with a precise economy of movement picked up a slice, smelled it, ate it in 2 bites, and then looked at her directly for the first time. "Where'd you get the starter?" he said. "I brought it from Chicago." "You brought a sourdough starter on a bus from Chicago?" "Yes." Dale looked at the bread again. "Huh," he said. Something in his face that might, on a more expressive man, have qualified as impressed. Cole came in last. He sat at the head of the table. He poured his own coffee from the pot she'd set on the table, which she'd noted he preferred to do rather than have it poured for him, another detail filed away. He looked at the bread basket. He took a slice. He ate it. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was not warmth. She still wasn't expecting warmth, but it was different from what it had been the day before. It was the expression of a man who has made a calculation and found that his original numbers were off, and who has the intellectual honesty to register that fact, even if he hasn't yet figured out what to do about it. He said nothing. He poured a second cup of coffee and put his hat on and went back out into the cold. But he'd taken the bread. The thing about Iron Ridge Ranch that Elena understood within 5 days of arriving, not from anything Cole said to her, because Cole Maddox was not a man who explained things when he thought they were obvious, and he thought most things were obvious, was that the ranch was in serious trouble. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the kind of trouble that has been accumulating for long enough that it has the settled quality of furniture. Nobody mentions it anymore. It's just there. She could see it in the way the hands handled equipment, the careful, deliberate movements of men who have been told, implicitly or explicitly, that what breaks might not get replaced. She could see it in the pantry inventory, in the way supplies had been stretched and substituted and deferred. She could see it in Cole's face when he came in from the barn on the 3rd evening and sat down at the kitchen table, not for supper. It wasn't supper time. He just sat down and looked at the surface of the table for a long moment in a way that had nothing to do with looking at the table. Elena was at the stove. She didn't ask him what was wrong. She knew he wouldn't tell her. She poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of him and went back to the stove. He drank it. After a few minutes, he said, without preamble, Victor Hale's man was at the north fence today. She didn't know who Victor Hale was yet. Doing what? Measuring. She turned around. Measuring what? Land. He said it flat. No inflection. Hale's been buying up the smaller operations east of here. He's been at the Breckenridge place for 6 months. Before that, the Jorgensen parcel. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He doesn't buy what he can't push into selling first. And he's working on Iron Ridge. Cole didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Elena turned back to the stove. She adjusted the damper, listened to the fire settle. The debt position, she said. A long pause. That's not your business. I'm not asking as your cook, she said. I'm asking because I'm trying to understand what I'm working with. Another long pause. Longer, she could hear him deciding. The banknote comes due in April, he said finally. It was refinanced twice. The terms aren't favorable. How much, he told her. The number was not as large as she'd feared, which surprised her. And then she realized the problem was not the amount, but the margin the ranch was operating so close to its edge that a number that should have been manageable had become a wall. She thought for a moment. She thought about the bread. She thought about the way Tex had said, "Is that sourdough?" And Dale had looked at her directly for the first time. She thought about Pete Ackerman and his supply truck, and the fact that he serviced routes to 4 or 5 ranches and the towns between them. If I doubled bread production, she said, and you were willing to let me use the space and supplies, could we sell to the other operations on Pete Ackerman's route? Cole looked at her. I know how to price it, she said. I know what margin looks like and what it doesn't. And people in remote operations will pay for good bread because they don't have time to make it themselves. He kept looking at her. It won't solve April, she said. Could be part of something that does. Cole's jaw moved in that way she'd come to recognize deciding something. You baked bread for 3 years in Chicago? I baked bread because I needed something to keep my hands busy while I figured out how to survive, Elena said. Turns out they're related skills. He studied her for another long moment. Something in his face she couldn't quite read, not quite respect, not quite suspicion. Something in between, moving toward the first. We'd need another order of flour, he said. I know. I'll write it up tonight. He stood, took his mug to the basin. Rinsed it himself, she'd noticed he always did that, never left his dishes, and walked to the door. Don't stay up too late, he said. It wasn't kind. It wasn't unkind. It was the voice of a man who runs a ranch and knows that everything runs on sleep, and that lost is like lost money, gone and not recoverable. But it was something. Elena turned back to the stove and banked the fire for the night, and began writing her flour order by lamplight. And through the wall she heard, faint but distinct, the sound of a child coughing. She hadn't known there was a child in the house. She sat still for a moment, listening. Coughing stopped. She went back to her list. But she did not forget what she'd heard. She met Lily Maddox on the 6th morning. Lily was 8 years old and appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:47 in the morning, wearing a nightgown and a pair of wool socks that were too big for her feet, holding a small cloth doll with one button eye and one embroidered eye where the button had presumably once been. Elena was shaping the morning loaves. She looked up and Lily looked at her, and neither of them spoke. The child's resemblance to Cole was strong, the same dark eyes, the same quality of stillness, the same sense of someone doing a rapid calculation. But there was something in Lily's face that was not in Cole's, a kind of undefended quality, a hurt that had not had long enough to harden into something else. Cole had mentioned a wife once, briefly. In the context of the kitchen, she had handled certain things. Before, in a way that didn't invite questions. Elena had not asked questions. She went back to shaping. Lily did not leave. After about 2 minutes of silence, Elena set a small piece of dough on the end of the work table, not calling attention to it, just setting it there, and went to the pantry for the salt. When she came back, Lily had the dough in her hands. She was just holding it, not doing anything with it, the way children hold things they find interesting. Feeling the texture, the elasticity. She pushed a finger into it and watched it spring slowly back. You can shape it if you want, Elena said. Just press the air out first. Lily looked at her. Like this. Elena demonstrated on her own piece, pressing her palms flat against the dough's surface and working from the center outward. Lily looked at her hands, then at the dough. She pressed her palms flat, the same motion, smaller scale. They worked in silence. Lily's loaf, if it could be called, that looked like a small lopsided moon by the time she was done with it. She set it on the pan beside Elena's proper loaves and looked at it critically. It'll bake fine, Elena said. Ugly bread still feeds people. Lily almost smiled. Almost. She picked up her doll and walked back to the doorway and then stopped, without turning around. My dad doesn't like people in the kitchen, she said. Her voice was quiet and slightly hoarse, a child's voice just woken up. I know, Elena said. But the kitchen's mine now. So you can come if you want. A pause. Okay, Lily said. She left. Elena listened to the small sock-muffled footsteps going back down the hall, and she turned and looked at the pan of loaves, her 4 proper ones, and Lily's small lopsided moon, and she put them all in the oven together. When the bread was done, Lily's came out golden and a little misshapen and smelling exactly like everything else. Elena set it aside separately when she put out the breakfast basket. She didn't tell Cole which one was which, but she saw him pick up the small lopsided one and look at it for a moment before he put it back. She went to refill the coffee and didn't say anything. Some things don't need saying. The small lopsided loaf disappeared from the kitchen windowsill on the 3rd day. Elena had set it there after breakfast, not intentionally saved, just not thrown out, because there was still good bread in it, and she did not waste food. Had not wasted food since the years in Chicago, when Damien controlled the grocery money, and she learned to calculate every meal down to the last tablespoon of flour. She'd noticed it that morning when she came in to start the stove, sitting there in the cold window light like something Lily had left on purpose, though she doubted the child thought that deliberately about anything yet. Children that age operated on feeling. They moved toward warmth and away from pain, and everything in between was instinct. The loaf was gone by noon. She didn't ask about it. She made another small one the next morning, set it in the same place, went about her work. It was gone by midday again. On the 3rd day, she was at the work table when she heard the soft drag of sock feet on the kitchen floor and didn't look up from what she was doing, pressing down the air pockets in the afternoon's dough, methodical. Both palms flat, and Lily came and stood at the far end of the table and watched her for a while without speaking. It's the same motion every time, Lily said finally. It has to be. The dough has a memory. If you're inconsistent with it, it comes out uneven. Lily considered this with the gravity that 8-year-olds apply to things that interest them. Like a person. Elena looked up at that maybe. Yeah. Lily had a wildflower in her hand, a dried one, brittle from the cold, the kind you find flattened under a rock or along a fence post in November, when everything that blooms has given up for the season. She set it on the end of the table beside the dough, not giving it to Elena exactly, just placing it there. And then she put her palms flat on her own small section of dough, the way Elena had shown her. Press from the middle out, Elena said. I know, Lily said. I remember. She did remember. Her hands were more confident this time, less tentative. She worked the dough with the focused expression of someone who has decided this is worth learning. And Elena watched her from the corner of her eye and thought about the fact that this child had not spoken at breakfast in 6 days. Had not spoken to her father at the table or to any of the ranch hands, had just sat in her chair with her doll in her lap and eaten what was put in front of her with a careful quietness that was not a child's natural quietness. This was not shyness. Elena knew the difference. She had spent 3 years being very quiet in ways that had nothing to do with personality. She picked up the dried wildflower and set it on the shelf above the work table, against the wall where the lamp wouldn't knock it over. Lily noticed, but said nothing. They worked in silence until the dough was shaped, and then Lily washed her hands at the basin, with the serious thoroughness of a child who has been told to wash her hands properly, and has taken this instruction to heart, and she dried them on the cloth, hanging from the basin hook, and walked back out through the kitchen door without ceremony. Elena looked at the flour on the shelf. She left it there. The first order went out with Pete Ackerman on a Thursday. She had spent 2 evenings on the numbers, writing figures on the back of a flour sack she'd cut flat for paper, the price of ingredients at current supply costs, the labor hours involved, the weight and volume of the finished product, and then cross-referencing against what she'd learned from Pete in casual conversation about what the ranches and small settlements on his route currently paid for store-bought bread when they could get it, which was irregular because the freight schedule was unreliable and the quality variable. She showed the figures to Cole on Wednesday evening. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time without speaking. She stood across from him and waited. She had learned by now that Cole Maddox's silences were not empty, they were working silences, the kind that were actually thinking, and interrupting them was counterproductive. You're pricing it below what the billing supplier charges, he said. Start. Once we have the route established and people are expecting it, we adjust. And Pete takes what percentage for transport? I talked to him yesterday. He'll take 12% of the sale price per delivery in exchange for guaranteed space in the truck and priority loading. Cole looked up from the paper. You talked to Pete? He comes by every Thursday for the supply run. I was loading the order. I know when Pete comes, he looked back at the figures. You negotiated his cut to 12? He started at 18. We met in the middle, she paused. He respects a hard number. I gave him one. Cole was quiet again. Then he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who is reassessing something he thought he understood, how much bread can you produce on top of what you're making for the ranch? With the current stove, 4 additional full loaves per day, without compromising the ranch's supply. If we get a second proving basket and I adjust the firing schedule, I can push that to 6. 6 loaves a day, 5 days a week to start. I want to build the customer side before I commit to a daily volume I can't maintain in a hard week. Cole set the paper down on the table. He put one hand on it, flat, the same way he'd rest his hand on a fence post to test whether it was sound. An assessing gesture. And the ranch hand's food doesn't suffer. It won't, you can promise that? She looked at him steadily. I don't promise things I can't deliver. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. She had not seen Cole Maddox smile yet. Not really. Though she'd seen something that occupied the zip code of 1, which was the closest he seemed to get. He looked at the numbers again. All right, he said. All right, meaning yes? Meaning yes. She took the paper off the table and went back to the stove to check the evening loaves. Elena, Cole said. She turned. If it works, he stopped. Started again. If the margins hold, I want to talk about the other operations on Pete's route. There might be an appetite for other preserved goods. Not just bread. I know, she said. I've been thinking about that. He looked at her for a moment. With that expression, she still couldn't quite classify, not quite respect, not quite its absence. Something suspended between the two that was slowly, incrementally, resolving in one direction. Put his hat on and went out. Elena pulled the loaves from the oven, tapped the bottom of each one, the hollow sound that meant done. Actually done. Not surface done, but all the way through done, and set them to cool on the rack she'd fashioned from old fence wire bent into a grid. She allowed herself approximately 4 seconds of satisfaction. Then she started making a list of what she'd need to scale up. The first delivery came back with 2 problems and 1 surprise. The problems? One of the Henderson's Ridge ranches had a standing bread arrangement with a Billings bakery and wasn't interested in switching, which she'd half anticipated and had built into her low projection numbers. And 1 loaf had shifted in transit, and the crust was cracked along the length of it, which didn't affect the bread, but affected the appearance. And appearance mattered more than bakers liked to admit. She would need to solve the transport packaging. She spent an evening working through options, cloth wrapping versus wood crating versus straw bedding, and landed on a combination of cloth wrapped tightly, and then set upright in a wooden crate with straw packing the sides. She built 2 prototype crates herself from leftover barn lumber, because she'd found a hammer and nails in the equipment shed, and there was no point asking someone to do something she could do herself. The surprise, the Cowboy settlement, a cluster of 4 families living 12 miles north of Iron Ridge near the river bend, had not only bought the 2 loaves Pete had brought them, but had sent a note back asking for 4 loaves next week and whether she made anything else. She read the note 3 times. Then she went into the pantry and stood there for a while looking at her inventory with a different kind of attention than usual. Not the attention of scarcity, what do I have and how long will it last? But the attention of possibility, what could this become? She had honey. She had the dried peppers. She had access to the ranch's salt supply, which was substantial because Cole bought it in bulk for the cattle, and cured meat was a preservation technique she'd learned from her mother and had practiced through years of Chicago winters when she'd needed to make food stretch. She had the knowledge rattling around in her head from a lifetime of being a woman who cooked because she had to, which meant a lifetime of learning to be efficient with what was available. She started writing. She was still writing when Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway at 9 in the evening, which was unusual. He normally turned in by 8:30 because he rose at 4:30, and the arithmetic was simple. Calloway sent a note, she said, without turning around. I heard Pete mentioned it. They want 4 loaves next week, and they ask about other products. I know. She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe in a way she'd rarely seen him lean against anything not tense, not entirely relaxed either, but somewhere between the two, with the look of a man who has something on his mind that he hasn't yet decided to say. What? She said. It wasn't quite a question. The Hendersons aren't interested, he said. Tom Lyle at the switchback operation told Pete he's been looking for a reliable soap supply. His wife can't make the trip to Billings in winter. Soap. Rendered tallow and lye mostly. His wife makes their own in summer, but she's been sick this year. Elena looked at her list. She looked at the pantry door. She thought about tallow. They had access to it from the ranch's own cattle, a byproduct that currently went to waste, or was sold at low margin with the other rendering products. She thought about lye, which she'd need to order, and about the mold making, which was the easy part, and about the curing time, which was the hard part because soap needed 6 weeks minimum before it was safe to use, and that was 6 weeks of inventory she'd be carrying. It's a longer cycle than bread, she said. 6 weeks before first sale. I know. We'd need to carry it. I know that too. She looked at him. He was watching her with that measuring expression that she had come to understand was not skepticism exactly, it was due diligence. Cole Maddox did not dismiss things before he'd assessed them. He assessed them fully and then decided, and he decided honestly, without theater. I'd need the tallow yield from the next 2 processing runs, she said, and the lye order. Write it up. She turned back to her paper. I'll have it by morning. Cole pushed off the doorframe. She heard him start toward the hall. Then he stopped. Lily ate dinner tonight, he said, at the table. He didn't finish the sentence immediately. She was talking. A little. Elena kept her eyes on her paper. That's good. She hasn't done that in a while. A pause. Long enough. I don't know what you said to her. I didn't say much. Whatever it was, he stopped again. Cole Maddox was not a man who easily finished sentences that involved gratitude. He seemed to find them physically inconvenient, like a coat that didn't quite fit. It's good to hear her voice, he said finally. Elena nodded once, not turning around. She's got a good voice. She should use it. The footsteps went down the hall. The main door opened and closed. Elena sat in the lamplight and looked at her list for a moment and then kept writing. The trouble with Victor Hale arrived not with noise, but with paper. It was a Tuesday in early December, 17 days after Elena had started the bread route, when a man Elena had never seen before came to the ranch in a hired conveyance, not a working vehicle. A hired one, kind that cost money, and asked for Cole Maddox by his full name, in the way that people who have been sent by other people ask for things. Formally, without inflection, without any real interest in the answer. Elena was in the yard with an armful of wood when the conveyance stopped at the gate. She watched the man climb down and look around the ranch with the specific expression of someone who is not seeing the place itself, but a set of numbers that the place represents. She went inside. She put the wood down and went to the kitchen window and watched Cole come out of the barn and cross the yard to meet the man. Couldn't hear what was said. Cole's back was to her. But she could see the way his posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way a stranger would read. But she had been watching Cole Maddox for 3 weeks, and she knew the difference between his working posture and his braced posture, and what she saw when the hired man handed him the envelope was the latter. Cole read whatever was in the envelope standing in the yard in the cold. The hired man climbed back into his vehicle and left. Cole stood there for another 30 seconds before he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and went back into the barn. He didn't come in for the midday meal. Elena set his portion aside, covered it, and put it on the back of the stove where it would stay warm. At 2 o'clock, she was in the middle of the afternoon bake when she heard him come in through the side door. He sat at the kitchen table. She waited. Hales sent a formal offer, he said. She set down her dough scraper. For the ranch. For everything. Land, buildings, water rights. The offer is, he stopped. It's low. It's below the bank debt. If I accepted it, I'd be clearing the note and walking away with nothing. But you'd be clear of the debt. Yes, she turned around. Cole was sitting at the table with both hands flat on the surface, not wrapped around a mug, just flat, the way a man sits when he needs to feel something solid. Paper was folded in front of him. What's the deadline on the offer, she said. 60 days. What happens to the hands if you sell? A muscle moved in his jaw. Hale will consolidate with his other operations. Most of them will be let go. And Lily, he looked at her. Where does Lily go, Elena said, if you sell the ranch and walk away with nothing? It was not cruelty. She asked because it was the actual question, the one underneath all the other questions, and she had learned in 3 years of surviving a man who never named the real thing that naming the real thing was the only way to actually address it. Cole's jaw tightened. She goes where I go, and where's that? I don't know yet. Elena turned back to the stove. Then you don't accept the offer. It's not that simple. I know it's not. I'm not saying it is. She adjusted the damper. I'm saying you don't accept it because the alternative you're actually weighing isn't the offer versus the debt, it's this offer versus whether what we're building has a chance to matter before April. She heard him shift in his chair. What we're building, he said, with a flatness that could have been skepticism, or could have been the particular flatness of a man encountering something that had not quite registered before. The bread route, the Callaway order, the soap production once the first run cures. She faced him. I did the numbers again last night. If the Callaway order holds and we pick up 2 more settlements by February, and the soap moves the way I think it will, it's not the full note payment by April, but it's a case to bring to the bank for a renegotiation. Banks don't renegotiate out of generosity, no. They renegotiate when the alternative is a distressed sale, and they get less than the note value. I know how banks think. I spent 3 years watching my husband use them. She said it evenly, without drama. If we can show an operating margin and a growth line, there's a conversation to be had. Cole looked at the paper on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Who taught you this? He said. The numbers. Survival, she said. Same teacher as everything else. He picked up the paper and folded it again, and put it back in his coat pocket. He looked at the covered dish on the back of the stove. Is that my midday meal? He said. It's been there 2 hours. It'll be dry. I'll eat it anyway. She set it in front of him without comment. He ate. She went back to the bread. December deepened, and the cold became serious in a way that November cold in Montana is not quite serious. November is a warning. December is the thing itself. The temperature dropped to levels where exposed skin went numb in minutes, and the horse's breath hung in the air long after they'd moved away from the spot, and the water in the barn troughs needed breaking every morning at dawn. Elena learned the cold the same way she'd learned the stove, methodically, without complaint, by understanding what it could do and working within it. She made a list of everything in the kitchen that would freeze if the fire went low in the night, the sourdough starter above everything else, which she began sleeping with beside her, in the small room off the kitchen, wrapped in cloth and set near the residual warmth of the stove flue. She worked out a wood rotation with Billy Crane, who turned out to be more capable than he appeared, and considerably more willing to work than his youth and hat-wearing habits at the table implied. She had him splitting extra wood 2 afternoons a week, in exchange for first pick of the bread heels, which were the ends of the loaves that the hands didn't fight over, and which Billy, apparently, had a particular fondness for. It was a transaction. She was not sentimental about it, but she noticed that Billy began showing up to split wood on days she hadn't asked him, and she noticed that he started showing up to breakfast a few minutes early, and occasionally, if the kitchen was empty of anyone else, would stand near the stove with a cup of coffee and not quite talk to her, but not quite not talk to her either. He'd say a thing. She'd answer, he'd say something else. It wasn't conversation exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might become one. She thought about the note on her flour sack paper. She thought about what the ranch could carry and what it couldn't. And on a Thursday evening when Pete Ackerman came by late because the road had been bad and stayed for supper because it was too dark to push north, she sat across from him at the kitchen table after the hands had gone and spread her papers out and talked to him directly about the route. Pete was a practical man. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The Marchetti family at Copper Creek, he said. They've been buying bread from a settler woman up north, but she moved out in October. They've been without since. How many in the household? 7 with the workers. That's a weekly order of 3 loaves minimum. Probably 4. And what about the Sutter operation? You mentioned them last week. Sutter's a harder sell. He's a careful spender. Careful spenders still eat. Pete almost smiled. I'll talk to him. She made notes. She worked out the expanded delivery schedule with Pete's route constraints. He couldn't add more than 40 minutes of stops without the run becoming unprofitable for him. So she had to think about clustering. Which settlements were close enough together that a single stop could serve 2 households if Pete left one order, and the families were in the habit of sharing a road. By the time Pete left, it was past 9, and the kitchen was cold in the way kitchens get when the fire's been low, and you haven't noticed because you've been doing other things. She stoked the stove and put water on, and stood in the lamplight looking at her papers and thought, it might work. It wasn't certainty. It was closer to the feeling of a dough that's proofed correctly, that slight resistance, that spring back when you press, that sense that something living has done what it was supposed to do. She heard the floorboard in the hall, the particular board that always announced Lily. You should be asleep, Elena said. Lily appeared in the doorway in her nightgown. She had the doll. She also had a small piece of paper folded into quarters, which she held out in Elena's direction with the gravity of an official document. Elena took it, unfolded it. It was a drawing, done in pencil with the careful imprecision of an 8-year-old who is trying hard. It showed a table with things on it, loaves, she thought, though they were rounded and somewhat abstract, and 2 figures standing beside it. The taller figure had hair, indicated by lines radiating from its head. The shorter one had a dot for an eye and another dot lower, where the other eye might have been the missing button. Elena realized that was the doll, not a person. Or both, maybe. Lily had set herself and her doll into the picture together. "This is nice," Elena said. Lily watched her with those serious dark eyes. "Is that the kitchen?" Elena asked. "Yes, and the bread?" "And you," Lily said. "And me. And Martha." She meant the doll. "Thank you," Elena said. She looked at the drawing for a moment, then at Lily. "Go to bed." "I'm not tired." "Yes, you are. You're tired and cold, and you're standing in a kitchen in socks." Lily looked down at her feet as though this information was new and mildly interesting. Then she looked back up. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "Yes." And the day after, Elena looked at her. She understood what was actually being asked. She understood it the way you understand a hunger that has nothing to do with food. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to be here." Lily once, with the solemnity of someone receiving a formal promise, turned and went back down the hall, and Elena listened to the sock feet on the floorboards until they stopped, and then she folded the drawing carefully and set it on the shelf above the work table beside the dried wildflower. It was Dale who told her about Victor Hale. Not intentionally. Dale was not a man who told people things intentionally. He communicated in the way water moves around stone, finding the path of least resistance, and the least resistance was often silence. But he had taken to sitting on the bench just outside the kitchen side door during the 20 minutes between his afternoon work and supper, and Elena had taken to setting out a mug of coffee on the bench when she knew he'd be there, not making an event of it, just putting it there, and Dale would drink it, and occasionally, the way you occasionally say a thing you've been carrying for a while, when there's no particular reason to say it, except that you've been carrying it, he would say something. He'd been working the Iron Ridge fence line for 6 years. He'd watched Cole's wife die of a fever the winter before last, had watched Cole carry that weight in the way men carry impossible weights badly, quietly, alone. He'd watched Lily stop talking and Cole not know what to do about it, and the previous cook, the corn-paced woman, last approximately 4 months before the isolation, and the cold and the difficulty got to her. He said none of this directly. He said it in fragments across many evenings in the way people tell the important things. What he said directly, on a Friday in the second week of December, was, "Hale's done this before." Elena set down her coffee mug. "Done what?" "Run men out." Dale looked at the mid-distance, the particular gaze of someone reviewing something stored a long way back. The Jorgensen parcel. What Hale told people was that Jorgensen wanted to sell, took the offer voluntarily. What actually happened was Hale got a man inside who filed a water rights complaint with the county, said Jorgensen was diverting from the main creek in violation of the downstream allocation. Took 2 years to get sorted, cost Jorgensen more in legal fees than he had, and he sold. Elena was quiet for a moment. "Who was the man inside?" Dale looked at her sideways. "Lawyer named Crane." Crane, she kept her face still. "Billy's family?" "Uncle," Dale said. "Billy doesn't know. Or he does, and he pretends he doesn't. Either way, he's not a part of it. He's a kid. I know he's not a part of it. I'm just saying." "I know," she thought for a moment. "Is there a water rights issue at Iron Ridge?" "No actual one. The creek allocation's clean. Cole's got the papers. But that's not the point. Is it having the right papers doesn't stop someone from filing the complaint. And while you're fighting the complaint, you're also fighting the legal bills. And you can't always do both." Elena looked at her hands on the mug. "Does Cole know this, about the Jorgensen parcel?" "He knows some of it. Not all the details. He needs to know all the details." Dale looked at her. In 6 years at Iron Ridge, Elena suspected not many people had said the obvious thing to Cole Maddox in that flat, undecorated tone. Dale seemed to find it, if not exactly warming, at least accurate. "Yeah," he said, "he does." She told Cole that evening. All of it in the same flat way, because facts presented plainly are harder to argue with than facts presented with emotion. She told him about the Jorgensen water filing, about the legal drain, about what Dale believed about the mechanism Hale used. Cole listened. He sat at the table with his coffee, and he listened and he didn't interrupt her once, which she appreciated. When she was done, he said, "I know about the Jorgensen filing. But not the Crane connection, no." His jaw moved. "Not that. There's a territorial land investigator in Billings. Nathan Crowell. He handled a fraud case in the Eastern County last year. Pete mentioned it once. He works independent of the county system. I know who Nathan Crowell is. Then you know he's the person to talk to before Hale files anything here." Cole looked at her. "This isn't your fight." The word landed and she let it sit for a moment before she answered. "I know it isn't," she said, "but I'm here. And what happens to this ranch is what happens to the bread route. And the bread route is the thing that has a chance of getting you to April. So whether it's my fight or not, it's connected to mine." He didn't answer right away. He looked at his coffee. Then he said in a tone that was not quite anything she had a clean name for, "You came here to rebuild yourself. That's what you said." She had said that to no one. She had thought it, on the bus from Chicago, looking at the land opening up outside the window. "I didn't say that to you," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's what you did." She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her with those dark eyes that were the same as Lily's, and were also nothing like Lily's, where Lily's held an undefended hurt. Cole's held something that had been hurt and had then covered the hurt with something practical and load-bearing, the way you shore up a damaged wall. Functional, necessary, not the same as healed. She picked up her mug. "Write to Crowell," she said, "before the year turns." He wrote to Crowell the next morning. She knew because she heard him at the desk in the main room at 6 a.m. when she was on her way to start the stove, the scratch of pen on paper, methodical and deliberate. She went to the kitchen and started the fire and began the morning bread. The soap's first curing run was 6 weeks out from mid-November, which meant it would be ready in the first week of January. She spent 3 evenings on the batch, rendering the tallow with care, working the lye into it at the right temperature, too hot, and you scorched the batch, too cold and it seized, and then pouring it into the mold she'd made from scrap pine, greased with a thin coat of the leftover lard. The smell was considerable. Billy Crane appeared in the kitchen doorway during the pour, sniffed and withdrew without comment. Hollis, more resilient, came in and watched for a while with the expression of a man witnessing something he can't quite categorize. "Is that soap? It will be in 6 weeks. What's it made of? Tallow and lye. Tex considered this. That's what my grandmother made. Most people's grandmothers did. She used wood ash. That works too. The lye from wood ash is less consistent, so the cure is harder to predict. The commercial lye gives you a more reliable batch." Tex nodded as though this was information he had been waiting years to receive. He left. She covered the mold with cloth and set it in the pantry where the temperature was stable and cold without being freezing, and left it to begin its long, slow work. The thing about soap, Elena thought, was that it was a lesson in patience that had practical consequences. You couldn't rush the saponification. You couldn't check on it every day and expect it to go faster. Put it in the right conditions, and you left it alone and trusted the chemistry to do what chemistry does when you give it time and space and don't interfere. She had spent 3 years with a man who could not give anything time and space, who checked and rechecked and adjusted and controlled because he was constitutionally incapable of trusting a process he couldn't see. She thought about that sometimes in the kitchen, doing the things that required patience. The bread, the soap, the slow business of earning the hand's trust one meal at a time. She thought about how much of what she knew came from having been controlled, which was an ugly thought but an honest one, that the skills she was using to build something here had been forged inside something that tried to break her. She didn't want to be grateful for that. She wasn't. But she was clear-eyed about it, which was different, and clear-eyed was what she had. The thing that changed the ranch hands happened on a Wednesday. Not dramatically. Not in a single moment. But Wednesday the 16th of December was the day she made the molasses bread. She'd been planning it for a week. She had a tin of molasses she'd found behind the dried beans, forgotten or overlooked. And she'd been waiting for the right day, not for a special occasion, but for the right combination of a cold afternoon and a long bake, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a working ranch when the wind is up outside and everyone is in from the deuce cold and sitting in the bunkhouse waiting for supper. The molasses bread came out dark and heavy and sweet in a way that nothing on the ranch had been sweet since she didn't know when. She made 2 large loaves and put them on the supper table beside the beef stew she'd been running since noon. And she went back to the kitchen to clean up, and she heard through the wall the exact moment the men cut into the first loaf. Then Tex said something she couldn't hear, and then she heard actual laughter, not polite sounds, but real laughter. the kind that comes out, because something genuinely catches you off guard. And then she heard Dale's voice, which she'd heard laugh exactly once in 3 weeks, and he was laughing too. And then she heard Billy Crane's younger voice running over the top of it all. She stood in the kitchen with a damp cloth in her hands and listened to the sound of 7 men laughing through a wall. It was not the bread that made them laugh. She didn't know what made them laugh, couldn't hear the words. But she heard the sound, and the sound was the sound of people who have been cold and pressured and stretched thin for a long time, and have momentarily, briefly, forgotten all of that, because something in front of them was unexpectedly good. Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had his supper bowl in his hand and a piece of the molasses bread, and he looked at her with that expression she'd been cataloging for 3 weeks, and still hadn't fully solved. And he said, "This is," and stopped. "Good?" she offered. "Different," he said, which she understood was Cole Maddox's equivalent of a considerable compliment. Took the damp cloth to the basin and wrung it out. "Different is fine," she said. "Different means they'll remember it." He ate standing in the doorway, which he did sometimes, and she didn't ask him to sit down because she had figured out by now that Cole Maddox ate standing in doorways when he needed to not quite be in a room, when he needed the room's warmth and noise, but also the option of the hall behind him. She understood that. She had spent years needing exits. He finished his supper and set the bowl in the basin, and stood for a moment with his hands on the basin edge, looking at something she couldn't see. Crowell wrote back, he said. And he's coming to Iron Ridge. 3rd week of January. Elena let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. He knows about the Jorgensen filing, Cole said. He said there are 3 other operations in the territory where he's seen the same pattern. He thinks there's enough to build a case if the documentation is solid. Then we make the documentation solid. It'll take time. And Hale's offer expires in 60 days. Let it expire, Elena said. Cole looked at her. Let it expire, she said again. Hale made that offer because he thought you were isolated and scared and out of options. He made it low because he thought you'd take anything. When it expires, he'll make another one, and if we've been building in the meantime, the second offer will be different, because the calculation will be different. You don't know that. No, she said, but I know what men like Hale think of women who run, and I know that the worst thing you can do for a man like that is stop running. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, and they could both hear it, the deep structural sound of a Montana winter making its presence known. He said nothing else. He put his hat on and went out through the main door into the cold. Elena turned back to the kitchen. She checked the stove's fire, adjusted the damper, put the leftover stew in the cold pantry where it would keep for tomorrow's midday. She stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen and listened to the wind and the distant sound of the men in the bunkhouse, still talking. Lower now, the comfortable end-of-evening sound of people who have eaten well. Picked up her pencil and looked at her papers. There was still a lot of work to do. She started writing. Nathan Crowell arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week of January, which was also the day Elena's second soap batch finished its cure, and the day Pete Ackerman's route expanded to include the Marchetti family at Copper Creek. She noticed later that the good things and the hard things had a tendency to arrive together, as though they were traveling the same road. Crowell was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture in her mind from Pete's description, a territorial investigator who'd cracked a fraud case in this eastern county, and the picture had been someone older, more weathered, the kind of man the frontier produced in quantity, hard-used and direct and slightly worn at the edges. Crowell was direct. She'd gotten that right. But he was younger than she'd imagined, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a precise and careful quality about him that reminded her less of a lawman and more of an accountant, the kind of person who reads every line of a document before signing anything, who notices when a number is off by $1 and considers that worth investigating. He came into the kitchen because Cole brought him there first, which Elena understood was its own kind of statement. Cole Maddox did not bring people into the kitchen casually. Kitchen was hers, and he'd understood that since approximately the 2nd week. When he wanted to show something that mattered at Iron Ridge, he started here. Crowell looked at the shelves properly bracketed now, all 5 of them level. He looked at the window, which had real glass in it since December. He looked at the stove, which had been properly reseated with a new plate that Tex had helped her fit in a 3-hour process, involving a great deal of careful measuring, and one moment where the whole thing nearly went sideways but didn't. He looked at the rack of cooling bread and the wrapped soap bars drying in measured rows on the far table, and the papers pinned to the wall beside the pantry door inventory lists, route schedules, margin calculations. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes," Elena said. He didn't say it like a compliment exactly. He said it like a man who is filing information, noting what is present and what it implies. She decided she respected that. She gave him coffee. He and Cole sat at the table, and she stayed in the kitchen because there was bread to manage, and also because some conversations are better heard from a slight distance, where you can listen without being required to respond in real time. Crowell had a leather case with him. He opened it on the table and laid out papers in a sequence that suggested he'd arranged them before he came, not casually sorted but deliberately ordered. A presentation structure. She could see from the kitchen doorway that some of the papers were land documents, the kind with surveyor notations and county stamps. The Jorgensen water filing, Crowell said, was initiated through a proxy. The complaint was filed by a land management firm called Territorial Resource Partners, which is a Billings-registered entity. On paper, it's independent. In practice, 3 of its 4 principals have prior business relationships with Victor Hale going back 8 years. Cole said nothing. She could see his hands on the table, flat, the same posture as when he'd read Hale's offer letter. "The pattern I've been tracking," Crowell continued, "is consistent across 4 operations in the territory. A formal offer is made always low, always time-limited. When the offer is declined, a regulatory complaint follows within 60 to 90 days. Water rights, grazing permits, land boundary disputes. Complaints are not fabricated exactly. They're technically arguable, which is the point. They don't need to win. They need to be expensive." "How expensive?" Cole said. Jorgensen spent $400 defending the water filing. He had $600 in savings. He sold 8 weeks after the complaint was filed. Kitchen was quiet except for the stove. "Has anyone challenged Hale directly?" Elena said from the doorway. She wasn't pretending she hadn't been listening. Crowell looked at her. "The difficulty is that Hale's name doesn't appear on any of the filings. Proxy structure is the protection. Then the proxy structure is what you take apart." "Yes," Crowell said, "which requires documentation of the business relationships, the timing of the transactions, and ideally a pattern consistent enough that a territorial judge will see the coordination for what it is." He paused. "That takes time." "How much time?" Cole said. "Months. Possibly longer. Hale's offer expires in 41 days. "I know." Crowell looked at his papers, let it expire. If Hale moves to a regulatory complaint after the offer lapses, that complaint becomes evidence of the pattern. It's actually cleaner for the case if he does. Cole looked at Elena. Elena looked at Cole. "That's what I said," she said. Cole's jaw moved in that way she'd come to read accurately now. It was not quite the beginning of a smile. It was the expression of a man who has made a decision, and is slightly irritated that it has been confirmed by 2 separate sources when he'd already made it, which meant there was no longer any comfortable ambiguity to stand in. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." Crowell spent 2 days at Iron Ridge, going through Cole's land documentation, the water allocation records, the bank correspondence. He was methodical and quiet, and ate what Elena put in front of him without comment or complaint, which she considered a baseline indicator of character. He asked her once on the second evening how long she had been at the ranch. 8 weeks, she said. He looked at the papers on the kitchen wall. "You built the bread route in 8 weeks. 7, roughly. And the soap. The soap took 6 weeks to cure. I started the first batch at 4 weeks. Crowell was quiet for a moment. "You know what Hale is actually after," he said. It wasn't a question, the water rights. The creek allocation from Iron Ridge feeds 3 downstream properties that Hale already owns. Without it, his eastern operations have a supply problem every dry summer. With it, he didn't finish the sentence. With it, he controls the water for the whole eastern valley, Elena said. Yes, she thought about that. About a man who thought in systems, who looked at a landscape and saw not the land itself but the leverage points, the places where control of one thing meant control of everything downstream of it. She had lived with a man who thought that way about people, who looked at a person and calculated what they needed and then made himself the necessary supplier of it. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No," Crowell said. "He won't. Then the case needs to be solid enough that stopping becomes the only rational option." Crowell looked at her for a moment. "There are other women," he said. "Other properties Hale's moved against. Some of them have documentation. If we can get statements." "Do it," Elena said. "Whatever you need from this ranch, document it and take it with you." Crowell nodded once. He went back to his papers. Elena turned to the stove and stood there for a moment with her back to the room, looking at the fire through the grate seam. She was thinking about Damien. Not because Damien and Victor Hale were the same, they weren't, exactly. Hale operated through systems and proxies and distance. Damien had been personal, immediate, intimate in his control. But the underlying architecture was identical. Find what someone needs. Position yourself between them and it, and then apply pressure at the joint until they bend. She had bent for 3 years. She had not broken, but she had bent, and the difference between those two things was smaller than she'd wanted to admit for a long time. She was not bending now. Damien Cross arrived at Iron Ridge Ranch on a Saturday in February. She did not see him coming. That was the thing she replayed afterward, not with guilt, because there was nothing she could have done differently, but with the particular discomfort of someone who thought they had become harder to surprise and discovered they were not. She was in the yard with Lily. Lily had started coming to the yard in the late afternoons when the light was still good and the temperature was above the threshold that Elena had set. She'd told the child once, plainly, that if the temperature was below a certain mark, she should stay inside. And Lily had accepted this condition with the seriousness as she accepted all conditions that came with a clear, logical basis. On the warmer afternoons, she came out and watched whatever was being done, and lately she'd been helping Elena carry the soap to Pete's truck on delivery days, which she did with a gravity of purpose that made Tex Hollis once say, in Elena's hearing, that Lily Maddox was the most professional 8-year-old he'd ever encountered. They were standing near the fence on the south side of the yard when the vehicle came up the road. It was a hired conveyance, nicer than the one Hale's man had come in, kind that cost considerably more money and was meant to show it. Elena knew before the door opened. She knew from the vehicle and she knew from something in her body that she would not have been able to name precisely, but that she'd learned to listen to in the same way. She'd learned to listen to the stove, not superstition. Just pattern recognition, working faster than conscious thought. Put her hand on Lily's shoulder. Go inside, she said. Lily looked at the vehicle, then at Elena's face. Children read faces the way animals read weather, not from analysis, but from some deeper, more accurate attunement. She didn't ask questions. She went inside. Damien Cross stepped out of the vehicle. He looked the same. That was the first thing she registered. And it was disorienting in the way that all unchanged things are disorienting, when you yourself have changed the disconnect between what you remember and what you find, and the brief vertigo of trying to reconcile the two. He was wearing his city coat, the good wool one, and he had not dressed for Montana weather, which told her either that he hadn't thought it through, or that he had thought it through, and decided that being cold was less important than arriving looking like someone who did not make concessions to difficult conditions. With Damien, it was always the second thing. He looked at the yard, at the outbuildings, at the house. His expression was the one she remembered from every time he'd looked at something he'd decided wasn't measuring up. Then he looked at her. Elena, he said. She said nothing. He came toward her and stopped 10 feet away, which was the distance of a man who has rehearsed an approach and is executing it, not the distance of genuine uncertainty. He looked at her the way he always looked at her when he wanted her to feel assessed top to bottom, deliberate, designed in to produce self-consciousness. She was wearing her work clothes. Her hands were rough. Her hair was done practically, not decoratively. She looked exactly like a woman who worked hard in a cold place, and she did not feel self-conscious about any of it. You look different, he said. I am different. He studied her for another moment. Been hiding. I've been working. Elena. He said her name again with that particular inflection. She'd had nightmares about the tone that implied she was being unreasonable, that implied that whatever she felt was a misinterpretation of a reality that only he had access to. You left without talking to me, without there are things to discuss. Legal things. The apartment. The accounts. Talk to my lawyer. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger yet. He was still in the patient mode. You don't have a lawyer. I have a letter of referral from Nathan Crowell, she said. He recommended someone in Billings. It was not entirely true yet. It would be true by the end of the week, because she intended to make it true. But she said it with the steadiness of a fact, because she had learned, living with Damien Cross, that the moment you hedge is the moment he finds the edge to press. His face shifted, just slightly. The patience recalibrated. Who is Nathan Crowell, he said. A territorial investigator. A longer pause. What have you been telling people? The truth, Elena said, which is that I left a controlling marriage and came here to work, and that I intend to stay. You don't have legal standing, too. I have legal standing to be exactly where I am, she said. On land that isn't yours, in a state you have no jurisdiction in, doing work you have no claim on. Whatever you think you came here to accomplish, Damien, I'd like you to say it plainly, and then get back in that vehicle. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running calculations, the same process she'd watched for 3 years. Only now she could see it from the outside, and from the outside it looked less like authority, and more like a man who is discovering that a situation he thought he controlled has variables he didn't account for. You think these people are going to protect you, he said. Patience was thinning now. She could hear it. You've been here, 2 months? These aren't your people, Elena. You're the cook. I'm a partner in this operation, she said, which is more than I ever was in yours. She heard the barn door before she saw Cole. Came across the yard at his normal pace, not rushing, which she understood was deliberate, a man who runs signals alarm, a man who walks signals that he is unconcerned and that what is happening does not require emergency measures. He stopped beside Elena, close enough to be clearly positioned, far enough to give her the space she was standing in. He looked at Damien Cross. Damien looked at Cole with the assessment of a city man, looking at a rancher, noting the size, noting the work-worn quality, making whatever calculations city men make about men who work with their hands, which is usually the wrong calculation. Cole Maddox, Cole said, not introducing himself exactly, identifying himself, which is different. Damien straightened slightly. I'm here for my wife. I'm not your wife, Elena said. I haven't been your wife since I walked out of that apartment. Paperwork will confirm it. There is no paperwork yet. There will be. Cole said nothing. He just stood there, which Elena had come to understand was one of his most effective modes. He occupied space with a completeness that made the space feel smaller for everyone else in it, and he did it without effort or theater, which made it more effective, not less. Damien's eyes moved between them. She could see him revising his picture of the situation. He had come expecting to find her frightened and isolated. He had found her in a yard beside a man who was built like someone who'd spent 40 years doing difficult physical work and who was looking at him with the calm, unimpressed gaze of someone who has dealt with difficult livestock before and found the experience instructive. I'd like to speak with Elena privately, Damien said. No. She said, no, Cole said. His voice was entirely level. There was no aggression in it. There was also no flexibility in it whatsoever. Damien looked at Cole for a moment. Then he looked at Elena, and she saw something shift in him, the patience giving way not to anger, but to something colder and more considered, which was in some ways worse. She had seen this mode before. This was the mode in which he made long-term decisions. This was the mode in which he did things quietly and from a distance and let other people deal with the consequences. You've built yourself a little world here, he said to Elena. His voice was soft, conversational, pleasant. That pleasantness was the tell. I wonder how much these people know about you, about who you were before you arrived. Everything that matters, Elena said. You had a breakdown, Damien said. In Chicago, twice. There are records. There are records of 2 visits to a doctor. Elena said that you scheduled and accompanied me to speak with a physician you had selected, to describe symptoms you had characterized, produce documentation that would support a narrative you needed. She said it the way she'd rehearsed it in her head 100 times, since she'd gotten on the bus not with heat, because heat was what he wanted. Heat was something he could dismiss as instability. She said it with the flatness of a deposition. Those records say what you wanted them to say. They don't say what happened. Damien's pleasant expression didn't change. That's a serious allegation, yes, she said. It is. You'd have a hard time proving it. Maybe, she said. But I'm not alone in it. There are other women, Damien. Women you did the same thing to before me. And it turns out, when you get enough women who know a man's pattern, the pattern is a lot easier to prove than any one account. She watched his face then. She had been watching his face for 3 years, and she was good at it. She saw the thing that moved across it, not fear exactly, not yet, but the first structural acknowledgement that the situation had dimensions he had not anticipated. He looked at Cole again, then back at her. Then around the yard, in a slow, assessing sweep, the way you look at a place when you're deciding whether it can be used. You've been talking to a lawyer, he said. I've been talking to several people, she said, and they've been talking to each other. A long silence. The wind came down from the ridge and moved across the yard, and neither of them flinched, which was its own kind of statement. I'm staying in Billings, Damien said finally. For 2 weeks. His voice had gone back to neutral, the full withdrawal from any register that could be used against him. I'd encourage you to think carefully about how you want this to go. I have thought carefully, Elena said. That's why I'm still standing here. He looked at her for the last time with an expression she'd never quite seen on him before. Not the calculation, not the patience, not the cold consideration. Something that was almost genuine, which was the most unsettling thing of all. Like a glimpse of something that had been there once, a long time ago, before whatever he had become had taken it over completely. Then he turned and walked back to the vehicle and got in. It drove away down the frozen road and disappeared between the ridgelines. Cole stood beside her, and they both watched it go. Billings, he said. He won't leave after 2 weeks, Elena said. He'll think of something. What kind of something? She thought about Victor Hale's proxy structure. She thought about Damien's way of operating the physician visits, the careful documentation, the construction of narratives through third parties who believed they were simply doing their jobs. Two men who had never met each other, who would not recognize what they had in common if you put them in the same room, operating on the same fundamental principle, that if you build the structure carefully enough, you never have to put your hands on the thing you're destroying. Something with lawyers, she said. Something with paper. Cole was quiet for a moment. Crowell's still in contact? Yes. Tell him Cross is in Billings, I will. She went inside. She went to the kitchen and stood at the work table for a moment, with her hands on the pine surface, feeling the solidity of it, the real wood grain under her palms, the weight of the thing, the simple factual presence of a table that had been in this kitchen for 20 years and intended to be here for 20 more. Then Lily appeared in the doorway. She had the doll. She looked at Elena with her dark, serious eyes. Is he gone? She said. Yes. Is he coming back? Elena considered how to answer that. Could have said no. She could have said probably not. She said neither. He might try, she said. But this isn't his place, and we're not going anywhere. Lily looked at her for a long moment, the assessing look she'd inherited from her father, and was currently deploying with her own particular 8-year-old gravity. Okay, she said. She came into the kitchen and climbed onto the stool at the end of the work table and set her doll on the surface and picked up the small piece of waiting dough without being asked. She pressed her palms flat and began from the middle, the way she'd been shown. Elena watched her for a moment. Then she picked up her own piece and did the same. The stove was going. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge and down into the yard and went on past. The way wind does, it doesn't stay anywhere long. It just passes through, and the things that are rooted simply wait for it to finish. Tex heard about Damien Cross from Dale, who had been at the far end of the barn during the conversation in the yard and had heard enough to understand the shape of it. By supper, the hands all knew, or knew enough that a man had come from Chicago, that Elena had sent him away, that Cole had stood beside her while she did it. Nobody said anything about it at supper. They ate, and the conversation ran to cattle and weather, and the condition of the north fence, which needed attention, which it always needed. But after supper, when the men were filing out, Tex paused at the kitchen door. You need anything, he said to Elena. Any of us. He gestured vaguely in the direction of the bunkhouse. You just saysy. She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance in the way he looked at the middle distance, when he was saying something that made him slightly uncomfortable, but that he decided needed saying. Thank you, Tex, she said. He nodded and put his hat on and left. Dale was last out. He didn't say anything. He rinsed his bowl at the basin. He'd started doing that sometime in December, following Cole's habit without being asked, and set it on the drying rack and walked to the door. He stopped. My grandmother, he said, not turning around, ran a boarding house in Wyoming for 11 years after her husband died. People said she couldn't manage it alone. He paused. She managed it until she decided she didn't want to anymore. He left. Elena stood in the kitchen and looked at the closed door for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove and checked the banked fire for the night and put out all but one lamp, and sat down at the table with her papers and her pencil and the mason jar of sourdough starter sitting on the shelf above her. And she wrote down everything she remembered from the conversations in the yard, every word Damien had used, every implication, every thread she could pull from what he'd said and what he hadn't. She wrote it all down, 3 pages of it, small and careful. She would send it to Crowell in the morning, with the note about the Billings location. Outside, the wind was still going. She could hear it working at the eaves, testing, the way it always tested. She'd gotten used to it. You get used to what you have to live alongside. She put down her pencil and sat for a while in the quiet. She was not afraid. She noticed that, the way you notice a thing that has changed gradually until one day you simply look at it, and it's different, not afraid the way she'd been afraid for 3 years. The cold, constant background hum of it. There was something else now. Not fearlessness. She wasn't making that mistake. But something more like the feeling of standing on solid ground and knowing it's solid, because you tested it yourself, because you put your weight on it deliberately, and it held. She had tested this ground. It was holding. She put out the last lamp and went to her room and slept. Crowell's response to her 3 pages of notes arrived 6 days after she sent them. It was not a long letter. Crowell was not a long letter kind of man. She'd understood that from the 2 days he'd spent at Iron Ridge, the way he communicated in precise, load-bearing sentences, with nothing decorative around them. The letter said, Cross's presence in Billings is noted. There is a woman named Margaret Holst in Cheyenne, who used the same physician Cross referenced. She has agreed to speak. There may be others. Document everything he sends you. Do not respond to anything directly without consulting counsel first. She read it twice, folded it, put it in the tin box she kept under the floorboard in her room beside the mason jar on cold nights. The tin box had started with her $342 in it. The money had been spent on supplies, on the lie orders, on 2 new proving baskets, and a proper bread knife she'd bought through Pete's supply run. The box now held the folder of papers that constituted, collectively, the documented history of what Damian Cross had done to her and what she intended to do about it. She had started thinking of the tin box as her case. Not emotionally, practically. The way you think of a tool you're building toward a specific use. Damian's first move came 11 days after his visit to the ranch. It came as a letter from a Billings law firm, Castor and Reed, 2 names she didn't recognize, addressed to Cole Maddox, inciting concerns about an employee of Iron Ridge Ranch who was subject to an ongoing legal matter in the state of Illinois. The letter was careful and technical and said, in the particular language of lawyers who are doing something aggressive while maintaining the form of something reasonable, that Elena Whitmore was the subject of a competency evaluation proceeding in the Illinois courts, and that her current employer might wish to be made aware of his potential liability in employing an individual whose legal standing was, as they put it, under active review. Cole put the letter on the kitchen table in front of her, without a word. She read it. Her hands did not shake. Competency evaluation, she said. That's what it says. She set the letter down. She looked at it for a moment, at the careful letterhead, the formal language, the 2 names at the bottom, with their credentials listed after. She thought about the physician visits Damian had arranged, the documentation he'd built, the narrative she'd named in the yard when he came. She had known this was coming. She had told Crowell it would come with lawyers and paper. She had been right about the form of it, even if the specific mechanism still had the power to land cold in her chest. Because knowing a thing is coming and feeling it arrive are 2 separate experiences. He filed this before he came here, she said. The timeline is wrong for him to have filed it after, which means he came here knowing it was already in motion. Cole looked at the letter. He came to see if you'd run.
Yes.
And when you didn't, he sent the letter.
Yeah.
Cole was quiet for a moment. What does a competency evaluation actually mean? Legally, in Illinois, without a finding, it means very little. It's a filing. It's the beginning of a process that requires hearings and evidence and a judicial determination. It doesn't mean I've been found anything. It means he's started a process and is hoping the existence of the process is enough to do the damage. Damage to what? She looked at him. To this. To whether you keep employing me. To whether people here believe I'm stable. To whether I'm willing to fight something that complicated from this far away. She paused. It's designed to feel too expensive to fight. Is it? Cole said. Is it what? Too expensive? She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking at her steadily, with the same expression he'd worn in the yard, when Damian had tried to make the space feel smaller, not alarmed, not flexing, just present, just asking an honest question. No, she said. Then we deal with it. She sent Crowell a copy of the letter that afternoon with Pete's truck. She wrote a second letter to the Billings attorney. Crowell had referred her to a woman named Clara Voss, who had been practicing territorial law for 14 years, and whom Crowell had described in 2 words, thorough and mean, the second of which he'd meant as a compliment. She laid out the Illinois filing, the timeline, the physician documentation, and the visit to the ranch. She was methodical about it. She wrote the way Crowell communicated load-bearing sentences, nothing decorative. Clara Voss wrote back in 5 days. Her letter was also precise and also said a great deal in a small amount of space. It said the Illinois filing is thin. A competency evaluation requires a petitioner with legal standing, in this case Cross, as the estranged spouse, and a basis in documented medical history. The medical history you've described is the manufactured kind, which is harder to prove than people think but not impossible, if the physician who produced it can be shown to have a prior relationship with the petitioner. Find that relationship. Also, I've spoken with Margaret Holst in Cheyenne. She's willing to submit a declaration. We need 2 more. Elena read that last line 3 times. We need 2 more. She thought about the yard, Damien's face, when she'd said there are other women. The structural acknowledgement she'd seen move across his features. He knew she'd been right. He'd known it before she said it. She wrote to Crowell that evening and asked him to follow the physician thread. The Hale situation moved in parallel and separately, and then, in the way that pressures do when they're being applied to the same structure from different directions, began to interact. Hale's formal offer expired on a Thursday without Cole accepting it. Elena was at the stove when the day passed and nothing happened, and she let herself feel the significance of that, the thing that didn't happen being its own kind of event, like a fence that held when you expected it to break. Cole came in that evening and sat at the table. The offer's lapsed, he said. I know. Crowell thinks the complaint comes within the next 30 days. Probably. He put his hands flat on the table. She had come to understand that gesture completely by now. It was Cole grounding himself, the physical equivalent of checking that the floor was still there. If they file a water rights challenge while I'm already dealing with the bank in April, and while you're... He stopped. While I'm dealing with the Illinois filing, she finished for him. It's a lot of fronts. Yes, she said. She turned from the stove. Cole, look at me. He looked at her. The bank meeting in April, I've been running the numbers every week. The bread route now covers the Marchetti order, the Callaway standing order, 2 new settlements Pete added in January, and the Sutter family, who turned out to want 4 loaves a week once they tried the molasses batch. The soap has its first reliable buyers. The margin on both combined is not the full note payment, but it's enough to walk into that bank meeting with a documented revenue line and a growth projection. She paused. That's different from walking in empty. That's different from what Hale expected. It's still not the full payment. No. But banks don't foreclose on operations that are generating income and growing. They foreclose on operations that are standing still and drowning. We are not standing still. Cole looked at his hands, then back at her. The water rights challenge, if it comes. Crowell has the documentation of the Jorgensen pattern. If Hale files through Territorial Resource Partners, it's the same mechanism he used before, and Crowell is ready for it. The challenge will still cost time and attention, but it won't cost us the ranch. You sound certain. I'm not certain, she said. I'm prepared. Those are different things, and I don't confuse them. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression that had been resolving incrementally for 3 months now, and had by this point resolved quite clearly in one direction, though he had not said so directly, and she had not pushed, because some things move at their own pace, and pushing them produces something that looks like what you wanted, but isn't structurally sound. The hands know what's at stake, he said. I told them last week. She hadn't known that. All of it? The bank. Hale. Enough. He paused. They're not going anywhere. She thought about Tex in the kitchen doorway. Dale rinsing his bowl. Billy Crane showing up to split extra wood on days she hadn't asked. I know, she said. Lily knows something's wrong, Cole said. Not the details. But she knows. Children always know. I don't know how to, he stopped. Started again. Started drawing again. She drew a picture of the ranch. The whole thing, all the buildings. She put everyone in it. He paused. She put you in it. Elena said nothing. She put you standing in the kitchen doorway, Cole said, which is apparently where you live, according to Lily. Something moved in Elena's chest that she did not try to classify. She turned back to the stove. Tell her the kitchen door is always open, she said. She knows that. I know she knows. A pause. I'm telling you because he stopped again. Cole Maddox and unfinished sentences were a long-standing pattern, she had noticed. He started things he found difficult to complete, not from evasion but from some genuine structural resistance in the way he'd learned to talk, or not talk, about anything that mattered to him. Because what, she said. Because she's not wrong, he said. About where you live. She kept her back to him. She kept her hands moving, checking the damper, adjusting the draft, doing the work of the stove that was always there to be done. No, she said. She's not. Crowell found the physician connection in the third week of February. The Dr. Damien had used a man named Fell, practicing in Chicago's North Side, had done work as an independent medical evaluator for 3 other legal proceedings in the prior decade, 2 of which involved the same law firm that had represented Damien in a prior business dispute. Connection was not explicit. It was the kind of connection that required tracing across multiple documents and that a person not specifically looking for it would never find. But Crowell was specifically looking for it, and he found it. And he sent Elena 8 pages of documentation with a cover note that said, "This is the thread. Pull it." She forwarded everything to Clara Voss. Voss wrote back in 3 days. Her letter was the longest she'd sent yet, which Elena had come to understand was proportional to Voss's interest level. The longer the letter, the more the attorney had found to work with. She had found quite a lot. The thread, once pulled, unraveled further than Elena had anticipated. Dr. Fell had produced evaluations in 2 prior cases, where the petitioner seeking the evaluation had a documented financial relationship with the law firm that later used the evaluations in legal proceedings. In one of those cases, the subject of the evaluation had later successfully challenged the findings in a separate proceeding. There was a pattern, and the pattern had a paper trail, and Clara Voss knew exactly what to do with a paper trail. "We have enough to file a challenge to the Illinois proceeding," Voss wrote. "And we have Margaret Holst's declaration. I've also been contacted by a woman in Denver, a Mrs. Audrey Crane, who says she has documentation from a similar experience with the same individual 3 years before your marriage. She would like to speak with you directly before she commits to a declaration." Elena set the letter down. She picked it up and read it again. 3 years before your marriage. She sat with that for a while. She sat with a particular, unpleasant texture of discovering that what happened to you had a history, that you were not the beginning of something, but the continuation of it, that the pattern predated you by years, that there had been a Mrs. Audrey Crane in Denver absorbing the same mechanisms while Elena was still a different person, living a different life, who had not yet made the choice she would later spend years trying to understand. She didn't feel better for knowing it. She didn't feel worse. She felt the strange, cold clarity of a thing that has been confirmed when you already suspected it, but had not wanted to be right. She wrote to Clara Voss and said, "Arrange the conversation with Mrs. Crane." The water rights challenge came on the 1st of March. It arrived exactly as Crowell had predicted, filed through Territorial Resource Partners, citing a disputed allocation calculation on the creek boundary between Iron Ridge and the adjacent parcel that Hale had purchased the previous year. The filing claimed that Iron Ridge's current usage exceeded its allocated share under the original territorial water grant and sought a review and reallocation. Cole put that document on the kitchen table too. Elena was beginning to understand that the kitchen table was where he brought things that required thinking through, which she found she did not mind. She read the filing. "Same mechanism as Jorgensen," she said. "Same firm," Cole said. "Same language, almost word for word." Crowell said to watch for it. "Does Crowell have the comparison documentation ready?" He filed a response with the territorial office yesterday. He anticipated the timing. Cole's jaw moved. "He said to tell you he was impressed by your prediction." "I wasn't predicting, I was reading a pattern." He said that too. She looked at the filing again. At the careful legal language, the technical framing, the way something aggressive had been dressed in the clothing of a bureaucratic concern. She thought about Victor Hale, whom she had never met, who had likely never thought about her at all. She was simply a variable in a situation he was managing, a minor complication in the acquisition of a water right he needed. She thought about what it meant to be a complication in someone else's calculation. She had been that for most of her adult life. First to Damien, now to Hale, each in their own way treating her as a thing to be accounted for and then removed. She was tired of being accounted for. "What does Crowell need from us now?" she said. "The original water allocation documents going back to the ranch's founding. He wants the complete chain. Where are they?" "Main room. I've been going through them. I'll help tonight." Cole looked at her. "You've got the morning bake and the soap batch and the delivery prep." "I know," she said. "I'll help tonight." He did not argue. She'd noticed he'd stopped arguing with her about capacity around the time she'd fixed the second shelf and replaced the window glass and produced the first successful soap batch all within the same week. He'd revised his original calculation about her limits and had not revised it back. They spent 3 evenings going through the ranch's foundational documents. It was not easy. Some of the older papers were brittle. handwritten in the particular scrawling style of men who'd been writing quickly in difficult conditions, and the filing sequences were not organized by any logic Elena could initially identify. But she was good at imposing order on disorder. She'd been doing it her whole adult life. She built a timeline, document by date, each one numbered, cross-referenced to the allocation figures in the original territorial grant. Cole found papers she hadn't known to look for. She organized what he found. By the third evening, they had a complete chain going back 22 years, clean and documented, and clearly showing that Iron Ridge's water usage had not varied meaningfully from its original allocation in the entirety of the ranch's operating history. She packaged it carefully, the papers in order, the timeline as a cover sheet, a brief explanatory note she wrote in the same flat, load-bearing style she'd learned from watching Crowell work. She gave it to Pete on his Thursday run. Crowell filed the evidentiary response to the water challenge the following week. The conversation with Audrey Crane happened by written correspondence over 2 weeks in March, because a direct meeting across that distance was not practical. Crane was precise and cautious in her first letter, the wariness of a woman who had decided once before to be brave about something, and had found it costly, and was now measuring before she stepped. Elena understood that. She wrote back without pressure, just the facts of her own situation, the physician documentation, the way the mechanism worked, and what she'd done to trace it. Crane's second letter was longer. She had recognized the physician's name immediately. She had seen Dr. Fell's name on paperwork from 3 years before her own situation had ended, in a context she'd been trying to understand for years. She did not use the word proof. She was careful. This woman, careful and angry in equal measure, anger kept in tight check by the patience of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something useful. She said, "I will give a declaration. Tell me what the lawyer needs." Elena forwarded the letter to Clara Voss and sat at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface. 3 women. Herself, Margaret Holst in Cheyenne, Audrey Crane in Denver. 3 separate accounts of the same mechanism, applied by the same person over the course of a decade. The physician thread connecting 2 of them directly, and the third by documented proximity. It was not a small thing. She heard the floorboard in the hall. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, doll in one hand, a piece of paper in the other. She held the paper out. Elena took it. It was another drawing more accomplished than the first, the lines more confident, the proportions closer to what they were meant to represent. It showed the kitchen, the shelves, the stove. 2 figures at the work table, 1 tall, 1 small, both with their palms flat on the dough between them. In the corner of the paper, in Lily's careful child's handwriting, home. Elena looked at the drawing for a while. "Thank you," she said. Lily climbed onto the stool. She pulled a small piece of dough toward her, without being offered it. She had stopped waiting to be offered things in the kitchen, around the time January turned to February, which Elena had noted as a good sign. "Is the man coming back?" Lily asked. She meant Damien. She had never asked directly before. "He's trying to," Elena said. "Some people from Billings are helping us make sure he can't do anything from there." Lily pressed her palms flat, worked from the center out. "What about the other man?" "The one Dale talks about." "Hale Dale says he wants the ranch." "He does." "Can he take it?" Elena looked at the child's hands, competent and small, working the dough with the focused seriousness she brought to everything she'd decided mattered. "Not if we don't let him," Elena said. Lily nodded, with the gravity of someone filing this information in a permanent place. They worked in silence for a while. The stove made its stove sounds. The wind came down off the ridge the way it always did in March, testing, looking for gaps. The bank meeting was the 14th of April. Cole left at first light with the complete documentation, the revenue records Elena had kept since November, the route schedules, the margin calculations, the soap production figures, the growth line projected through June. She had spent 4 evenings preparing the presentation materials, clean, ordered, everything labeled and cross-referenced. She did not go with him. She had offered. He said he needed to do this one alone, and she understood that there are things a person has to stand up for in their own name, and this was one of them. She had given him every tool she could build. What he did with them was his. She made bread. She did the morning bake, and the soap check, and the midday prep, and she did not think about the bank meeting, because thinking about it was not useful, and she had learned, slowly and at some cost, the difference between thinking that is useful and thinking that is just another form of waiting. Tex came into the kitchen at mid-morning for coffee. He stood at the stove for a while. He didn't say anything. He drank his coffee and rinsed his mug and left. Dale came in at noon. He sat at the table and ate and looked at his bowl. "He'll be all right," Dale said. Not to her specifically, more like a thing he was saying to the room. "I know," she said. Billy Crane came in at 1 o'clock, which was unusual. He was generally working fence at midday. Came and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the bread on the rack and then at Elena. "Can I have a piece?" he said. "It's for tomorrow's delivery." He looked at the floor. "Yeah." "Okay." She cut him a heel and handed it to him. He took it with both hands, the way you take something you actually needed. He ate it in the doorway, standing the way Cole ate sometimes. "Thank you," he said. "Go fix the fence," she said. He went. Cole came back at 6:15. She heard the horse before she heard anything else, then his boots on the porch, then the door. She was as at the stove. She did not turn around immediately, because some things you have to give a person a moment before they have to say them out loud. She heard him sit down at the kitchen table. She turned around. His face was not the face of a man who had lost, but it was also not the face of a man for whom things had gone simply, because things at that bank had clearly not gone simply. It was the face of a man who had been through something hard and was still processing whether the hard thing had also been good. They agreed to renegotiate, he said. 18-month extension. Different terms. She set her cloth down. The revenue documentation, he said. That was what moved them. The bread route, the production, the growth line. The loan officer, he'd seen the Hale offer in the county records, and he knew what Hale was doing with the Eastern Valley. He didn't say that, but he knew. Cole paused. He said that an operation showing growth and community integration was a different credit risk than an operation in isolation. Community integration, Elena said. Those were his words. Something moved in Cole's face, that expression she'd been watching for 4 months, that fractional, reluctant thing. I think he meant the bread route. I think he meant what you built. She looked at him. I told him, Cole said. At the bank. I told him it was yours. That you'd built it. It's the ranch's, she said. Elena. It's ours, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked directly yet. Cole looked at her across the kitchen table for a long moment. Yes, he said. It is. The Illinois competency proceeding collapsed in the last week of April. Clara Voss filed the challenge with the physician documentation and the declarations from Margaret Holst and Audrey Crane, and the Illinois court, faced with evidence that the petitioning physician had a documented prior relationship with the petitioner's legal representatives, and that 2 other women had provided sworn accounts of substantially similar circumstances, declined to advance the proceeding to a formal hearing. The filing was dismissed. Voss's letter was brief. Proceeding dismissed without prejudice. Cross may refile, but the evidentiary bar is now significantly higher. The physician relationship is on the record. I would be surprised if he tries again. Elena read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning after the delivery had gone out with Pete, and the bread was done, and the soap was curing, and the kitchen was quiet. Put the letter on the table. She looked at it. She thought about Damien's face in the yard, the pleasantness that was a tell, the cold consideration, the one unguarded moment at the end that had been almost genuine. She thought about Margaret Holst in Cheyenne and Audrey Crane in Denver, women she had never met, who had given a piece of themselves to this because she had asked, and because they had recognized in the asking something they'd been waiting to be asked. She felt something that she did not have a clean name for. Not triumph, she had learned to be suspicious of triumph, because it was a feeling that made you stop paying attention. Not relief exactly, though it was close to that. Something more like the feeling of a breath after a long time of not quite breathing fully. She put the letter in the tin box with the other papers. She picked up her pencil and started her next supply list, because the route was expanding again, and the numbers needed updating, and the work was always there, patient and practical, waiting for her to return to it. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing her coat and her big wool socks, which meant she'd come in from outside, which she was doing more of as March turned toward April, and the worst of the cold let go. She had a wildflower in her hand, the first one of the season, pale and a little stunted from the cold soil, but open. She walked to the work table and set it on the shelf beside the dried one from November, which was still there. It matches, Lily said. Elena looked at the 2 flowers, the dried one and the fresh one from almost the beginning and one from now. Almost, she said. Lily looked at them both with her serious dark eyes. Then she looked at Elena. Are you staying? She asked. The same question she'd asked in November, but different now, not the question of a frightened child. checking that the ground was still solid. Something more settled in it, more like she was asking, because she wanted to say it out loud. Yes, Elena said. Lily nodded. She picked up her piece of dough. Okay, she said, and she began. The territorial hearing on Victor Hale's water rights challenge was scheduled for the second week of May, which gave the cottonwoods along the creek just enough time to come out in leaf so that the ride into the county seat was, against all the practical weight of what the day meant, genuinely beautiful in the way that Montana in early spring is genuinely beautiful, not gently, not soft, but with the blunt force of a landscape that has been holding itself under ice for 6 months and has finally decided to be done with it. Elena rode with Cole in the ranch wagon. Crowell had come up from Billings the night before and stayed in the bunkhouse, which Tex had offered without being asked. The hands had made room without discussion. The way people make room when they understand that something important is happening, and that making room is their part in it. Dale stayed at the ranch with Lily. He had volunteered for this in the same way he volunteered for everything, by simply being where he was needed before anyone thought to ask. Lily had stood on the porch when the wagon pulled out. She had her doll in one arm, and she raised the other hand, not waving exactly, just raised, a gesture that was more acknowledgement than farewell. The gesture of someone who has decided to trust that the people leaving are also going to come back. Elena had raised her hand back. She thought about that on the ride in, about what it meant that an 8-year-old raising her hand from a porch could sit in your chest with that kind of weight. She had not come to Iron Ridge expecting to matter to anyone. She had come to find ground that was solid enough to stand on, while she figured out who she still was after 3 years of being told she was no one worth being. She had not expected the ground to have people on it who would, over the course of a winter and a spring, become people she would stand in a county hearing for. People she would go to considerable lengths not to disappoint. That was the thing nobody told you about rebuilding. It was not a solitary project. You thought it was. You showed up alone with a suitcase and your mother's mason jar, and you thought, I just need a place to be quiet and work and not be afraid. You did not think, I need 7 ranch hands and a taciturn rancher and his daughter, and a land investigator and a frontier attorney, and 2 women I've never met in Cheyenne and Denver. But it turned out that was exactly what you needed. And the humbling part was learning to accept help from all of it without letting the acceptance make you feel like you'd failed at the independence you'd come here to build. She had thought about this for months. She had not resolved it neatly, because it did not resolve neatly. What she'd come to was something more approximate, that needing people was not the opposite of being strong. It was what strong was actually for. The hearing room at the county seat was smaller than she'd expected a plain room with wooden benches and a county seal on the wall, and a territorial hearing officer named Aldous Briggs, who had the appearance of a man who had been doing this job for a long time and had developed, through sheer accumulated experience, an almost geological patience. He ran the proceeding without theater, which Elena found she respected. Territorial Resource Partners had sent 2 representatives and a lawyer, which was more than a routine water rights complaint typically warranted, which told her they'd understood what this hearing actually was before they arrived. The lawyer, a man named Pryor, pressed and careful, had clearly read Crowell's evidentiary filing and had spent time preparing a response to it because he didn't try to argue the allocation figures directly, which was smart. The figures were clean. He argued instead that the comparative documentation Crowell had submitted from the Jorgensen proceeding was not relevant to the present complaint. Crowell argued, with the flat precision that was his natural register, that it was directly relevant because it demonstrated a pattern of coordinated regulatory filings designed to produce a specific financial outcome rather than to address a genuine allocation dispute. He had the documentation of Territorial Resource Partners' principal relationships with Hale's other business interests. He had the timeline showing that the filing had come within 30 days of the expiration of Hale's purchase offer, which was the same interval as the Jorgensen filing. He had 2 additional cases from neighboring territories showing the same interval, the same firm, the same language. Pryor objected twice. Briggs overruled both objections in the same measured tone, made a note, and asked Crowell to continue. Elena sat beside Cole on the wooden bench and watched and did not speak because this was Crowell's work now, and the best thing she could do was not interfere with it. She had built the case she could build. He was doing what he did with it. Cole's leg was pressed against hers on the narrow bench. Not deliberately. The bench was simply not wide enough for both of them to sit without contact. Neither of them moved away. The hearing took 4 hours. Briggs recessed for 40 minutes, during which Elena and Cole sat outside on the courthouse steps in the May sunlight and did not talk about the hearing, because there was nothing useful to say about it now that wasn't already in the room working on its own. They talked about the fence line that needed attention on the north pasture, and whether Pete's route could absorb another settlement to the west that had sent an inquiry about the bread. Practical things. The kind of conversation that is really a way of saying, whatever happens in there, the work is still here. Briggs came back and read his finding in the same measured tone. The complaint filed by Territorial Resource Partners was found to be without sufficient basis in the documented allocation record and was dismissed. He added, in language that was careful but unambiguous, that the evidentiary record raised concerns about the filing's origins, that he was referring to the Territorial Attorney's Office for further review. That last part was not something Crowell had explicitly asked for. Briggs had added it himself from the record, which told her that Aldous Briggs had been doing this job long enough to recognize what he was looking at when he saw it. Pryor gathered his papers with the controlled movements of a man who is professionally obligated to look unaffected. 2 Territorial Resource Partners representatives left without speaking to anyone. Crowell shook Cole's hand and then looked at Elena and said, "You built a good case." He said it the way he said everything, no decoration, just the fact. "You made it work," she said. "It worked because the documentation was solid. Documentation doesn't build itself." She accepted that. What happens to Hale now? The Territorial Attorney's review is real. What comes of it depends on what else they find and whether the other operations are willing to come forward. He paused. The Jorgensen family might. After today's finding, the legal ground is different for them. And Iron Ridge? Iron Ridge is protected for this cycle. If Hale regroups and tries a different mechanism, he stopped. Think he moves on. The water right he wanted is only valuable in combination with the parcels he already owns. Contested acquisition that draws territorial attorney scrutiny is not the same calculation as an easy one. Men like Hale are not sentimental. They go where the friction is lower. Cole said nothing. He looked at the courthouse door for a moment. "Thank you," he said, 2 words simply. Cole Maddox did not inflate things. Crowell nodded. He picked up his case. "I'll be in touch about the attorney's review." He walked to his horse and south. They drove back to Iron Ridge in the afternoon light, the cottonwoods making their new leaf sound in the wind off the creek. And Cole did not say much, and Elena did not say much, and neither of them needed to. She told Lily that evening. Not the legal details, an 8-year-old does not need the legal details, but the essential thing, that the man who wanted the ranch had been told by the county that he couldn't have it, and that the people who'd been working to make that happen had done their work well, and that Iron Ridge was staying Iron Ridge. Lily received this information at the kitchen table with a piece of bread in both hands and her doll propped against the lamp, and she listened to all of it, and then she said, "Dale already told me." Elena looked at the door, where Dale had presumably been approximately 2 minutes before. "Did he tell you all of it? He told me the ranch was safe." Lily took a bite of bread. "He said you were the one who made it happen." "That's not exactly." "He said Cole did too," Lily said, "and the investigator man. But he said you started it." She looked at Elena with those eyes. "I know you did." Elena looked at her. "How do you know?" Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone who has a real answer and is deciding how to phrase it. "Because you fixed the shelf," she said finally. "When you got here, before anything else. You fixed the shelf even though nobody asked you." Elena sat with that for a moment. It was, she thought, a more accurate summary of character than anything she might have said about herself. "Eat your bread," she said. Lily ate her bread. The divorce was finalized in June through Clara Voss's office and an Illinois court that, with the competency proceeding dismissed and the physician record under official scrutiny, had very little basis for anything other than processing the papers as filed. Damian Cross did not contest it in the end. Voss's letter said he had retained new counsel, which was the tell new counsel meant the old counsel had told him to cut his losses, and cutting his losses was the only rational move left. And Damian Cross was, underneath everything, a rational man. Elena read the finalization letter at the kitchen table in the early morning, before anyone else was up, with the stove going and the sourdough doing its slow work on the shelf, and the 2 wildflowers, one dry, one long since dried itself, standing together on the shelf above. She had expected to feel something dramatic. She'd been bracing for it without realizing she was bracing, the way you tense before a cold plunge. What she actually felt was quieter than that, and harder to describe, not closure exactly, because she'd stopped believing in closure as a discrete event somewhere around the third month at Iron Ridge. More like a door that had been standing open in the back of a room, finally settling shut. Not a slam, just the soft mechanical finality of a latch catching. Put the letter in the tin box. She took the tin box out from under the floorboard and sat with it on the table for a moment. The whole accumulated weight of it, the papers. The letters, the supply lists and margin calculations. 3 pages of notes from the afternoon in the yard when Damien had come. The drawing Lily had given her in November, with home written in the corner. She took the drawing out and pinned it to the wall beside her supply charts, where she could see it when she worked. She put everything else back in the box. She went to the stove and started the morning bread. Cole found her there at 5:30, which was not unusual. Their early mornings had developed into a kind of shared territory over the months. Time when the ranch was quiet, and the work was just work, and the two of them occupied the kitchen and the adjacent hall in the particular comfortable proximity of people who have stopped needing to. Perform ease because they've arrived at the actual thing. Poured his own coffee. He looked at the drawing pinned to the wall, which was new, which he would have noticed. He didn't comment on it. He sat at the table. Voss's letter came yesterday, Elena said. I know. Pete mentioned it was in the delivery. It's done. Cole looked at his coffee. He turned the mug once in his hands, that gesture she'd catalogued so many times, the grounding one. How do you feel? It was not the kind of question he asked often. He was working at it. She could tell working at the asking of it, the same way he worked at the finishing of important sentences. With that structural resistance, he was gradually, incrementally, doing something about. Like it's done, she said. Not like it didn't happen. Just done. He nodded. I don't think I'll ever feel like it didn't happen, she said. Spent a long time wanting to feel that way. Like it could be removed. Like I could get back to something that was before it. She paused, shaping the next loaf, pressing from the center out. I think I wanted to rebuild myself into the person I was before Damien. And I think the person I was before Damien was 23 years old and didn't know very much. She paused again. What I rebuilt is different. It's the same material and a completely different thing. Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside the creek was audible through the window she'd reglazed in December, the sprinkled sound of it, loud with snowmelt. I was different after Sarah died, he said. Sarah, his wife's name, which he had never said in her presence before. I thought for a long time I was just less than I'd been. He looked at the table. Lily stopped talking and I didn't know how to reach her, and the ranch was going under, and I thought, this is what's left. This is what I am now. Less. She said nothing. She kept her hands on the dough. You show up, he said, and you fix the shelf, and you make bread, and you talk to Lily like she's a person with something to say, which she is, and you build a route and fight 2 men who are trying to take different things from this place. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped thinking of myself as less. Elena set the loaf on the pan. That's not because of me, she said. I know it's not. It's because of I don't know. Watching someone who has real reasons to stop, not stop. He paused. It's hard to feel like less when the person beside you won't accept that framing. She turned around and looked at him. Cole Maddox looked back at her across the kitchen, over his coffee mug. In the early morning light, with the expression that had been resolving since November, and had by now resolved completely not into something soft. Because Cole was not a soft man, and she was not a soft woman, and that was not what either of them were, or what either of them needed. Into something solid. Something that had been tested and had held. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. I want to ask you to stay, not as the cook. He paused. He was working at this one. She watched him work at it, as my partner. In the ranch and in whatever comes after the ranch. Lily's asked me 3 times in the last month if you were going to stay. I told her I didn't know. I want to be able to tell her I know. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the bus from Chicago, the 19 hours and 40 minutes. The land opening up outside the window into something enormous and indifferent. She thought about what she'd been looking for. Not safety, not exactly, though she'd needed that. Something more fundamental. She'd been looking for a life that was hers. A life she'd built from her own hands and her own decisions and her own willingness to fix the shelf before anyone asked her to. She had that. She had built it. And the question being asked of her now was not whether she would give it up for someone else. It was whether she wanted to build something larger than what one person could build alone. Whether she trusted that distinction. She had been wrong about that distinction once. She had confused being owned with being partnered, and the confusion had cost her years. She was not confused now. Yes, she said. Cole looked at her with that expression she no longer needed to catalog because she knew it completely. He nodded once, the way he acknowledged things that mattered to him without excess, without theater, with a weight that meant more for its quietness. Okay, he said. He drank his coffee. She turned back to the bread. The ranch's second winter was different from the first. Not easier. The cold was the same cold. The work was the same work. The north fence needed the same attention, and the soap needed the same 6 weeks, and Pete's truck ran the same roads. But different in the way that a familiar thing is different when you know you're staying, when the limitations of a place stop being obstacles and become simply the conditions you work within, the way you work within weather or soil or the particular character of a stove that runs hot on the left side. The bread route had expanded to 11 regular customers across 4 settlements and 3 ranch operations, including the Sutter family, who had in fact turned out to want a great deal of bread once they tried it, and had added a standing order for the honey variety that Elena had developed in October from the ranch's second honey harvest. The soap had its own list. There was talk, started by Tex and seconded by Dale in his oblique way, of whether there was a market for the dried pepper blends she'd been using in the kitchen, which there probably was, and which she was considering. The ranch note had been renegotiated and was being serviced. Not comfortably, not with anything to spare, but being serviced. The margin between what the ranch produced and what it owed had widened from a gap you could lose a hand in to something you could work with, which was all she had ever claimed it could be, and which she knew Cole had wanted to believe before he'd been able to. Hale had not come back. The territorial attorney's review of territorial resource partners was ongoing. Crowell wrote with updates every few weeks, careful and precise, and the picture was of a process that moved slowly, and would move slowly for some time, but that was moving, which was the thing. The Jorgensen family had come forward. There were now 6 operations in the territorial record, 6 documented instances of the same mechanism, and men like Victor Hale, who operated through careful structures designed to keep their names off the filings, ran out of options when the structures themselves became the evidence. She did not know how it would end for Hale. She knew how it had ended for Iron Ridge, and that was the part she had standing in. In November, a year from the day she'd arrived with a worn suitcase and her mother's mason jar, Elena stood in the kitchen before dawn and looked at the shelves, all 5 of them level, the window with its proper glass, the stove with its reseated plate, the flue pipe secure, the firebox door that no longer stuck, the work table with its gouge marks and stains from 11 months of daily use, which she had stopped thinking of as damage a long time ago. On the shelf, the 2 dried wildflowers, one from November and one from April, both the same pale color now, both still standing. The mason jar, the drawing pinned to the wall. She fed the starter, measured the flour, added the water by feel in the dark kitchen lit by the lamp she'd learned to work by. The flame adjusted to exactly the height that lit what she needed without wasting oil. This was not the life she'd had before. It was not a restoration. You could not restore what she'd had before, because what she'd had before had never been entirely hers to begin with. It had been built around a man's definition of her. And when she'd walked out with her suitcase and her mother's starter, she had not been fleeing back to some earlier, better version of herself. She had been walking towards something that didn't have a name yet. It had a name now. Several names, depending on what part of it you were pointing at. The ranch, the kitchen, the route, the tin box under the floorboard, which she still kept there, not because it needed to be hidden anymore, but because it was hers. Lily's drawing on the wall, Cole's coffee mug on the table. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her what she'd learned. Not the practical things, the stove management, the dough ratios, the margin calculations, the way to present documentation to a territorial hearing officer. The underneath thing, the thing the year had actually been about. Thought she would say, be careful what you let define the size of your life, because the people who want to control you will always offer you a ceiling and call it a home, and the ceiling is real, and it keeps the rain out, and you can live under it for years telling yourself that shelter is enough, and maybe for a while it is. But there is a difference between shelter and space, and the difference is that space is where you find out who you actually are when nobody is defining it for you. She had found out. She was a woman who fixed things before she was asked to. Who built routes and kept accounts and coaxed living cultures back from cold, and made soap that cured in 6 weeks, and told hard truths in flat sentences, and pinned children's drawings to her wall and raised her hand, from wagon seats to small figures standing on porches. She was not finished. She was not healed in the clean, complete way that stories sometimes imply. She still had days when Damien's voice arrived in her head uninvited, delivering verdicts in that pleasant, reasonable tone. She still had mornings when the old fear moved through her like weather, sourceless and residual. She suspected she would have those days for a long time, perhaps always. But she had also learned that you do not have to wait for the fear to leave before you start the bread. The fear can be there and the bread still rises. The two things coexist, and over time the bread becomes the larger thing, and the fear becomes something you carry without being carried by it. That was the work. That was always the work. Lily found her at the work table at 6:15, which was early even for Lily, who had been waking earlier and earlier as the mornings lightened, with the instinct of a child who has decided she doesn't want to miss things. Climbed onto her stool. She looked at the dough. "It's the anniversary," Lily said. Elena looked at her. "Of what?" "Of when you came." Lily said it matter-of-factly. The way she stated things she'd decided were important enough to track. "I asked Dad. He said it was around now." "Around now," Elena agreed. Lily put her palms flat on her piece of dough. She worked from the center, the way she always did, confident now, no hesitation. Her hands had learned the dough the same way Elena's had, through repetition, through showing up, through the accumulated memory of having done the thing enough times that the knowledge moved out of the head and into the hands, where it was more reliable. "Are you glad you came?" Lily asked. Elena looked at her. The serious face, the dark eyes, the doll propped at the end of the table with its one button eye and its one embroidered replacement, watching everything with the impartial attention of the well-loved. "Yes," Elena said. "Even the hard parts." She thought about that. She gave it the honesty it deserved. "The hard parts are part of it," she said. "You can't be glad about some of it and pretend the rest didn't happen. It's all the same thing." Lily considered this, working her dough. "Like bread," she said. "You can't have the crust without the baking." Elena looked at her. "That's right," she said. Lily nodded, satisfied, as though this confirmed something she'd been working out. Cole appeared in the doorway. He had his coat on already, which meant he'd been out to the barn, and he had 2 cups of coffee, his own and hers, which he'd started making without being asked sometime around March, and had simply continued, another thing that had started small and become part of the structure of the days. He set hers on the work table without comment. He looked at the two of them, Elena and Lily, side by side at the table, hands in the dough, and something moved in his face that he did not try to contain or redirect. He just let it be there, which was its own kind of change from the man who'd stood in the kitchen doorway 11 months ago, looking at a repaired shelf with the expression of someone who wasn't sure whether to be grateful or irritated. "Cold out," he said. "It's November," Elena said. "Fence on the north pasture needs looking at again. It always needs looking at." "Yeah." He leaned in the doorway in that way he had not quite in the room, not quite out of it, and drank his coffee. "Pete's coming Thursday. You need anything added to the order?" "I wrote it up last night. It's on the table. I saw it." He paused. "You added vanilla. For the honey bread." The Callaway order went up to 6 loaves. 6, they have a new hand, he eats. Something in Cole's face that was, by now, unmistakably a smile, even if it retained the brevity of everything else about him. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then the face returned to its working expression. But it had been there, and Lily saw it and looked at Elena with her own version of the same thing, bigger and less guarded, the way children smile when adults finally do what they've been waiting for them to do. The bread baked. The kitchen filled with the smell of it, the particular warm, yeasty, slightly sharp smell of sourdough in a wood-fired oven. The smell that had carried Elena through a bad marriage and a bus trip, and a frozen Montana November, and 11 months of building something that had no guarantee of holding. The smell that was, if she was being precise about it, the smell of her mother's kitchen, and therefore the smell of everything she'd been trying to get back to, which was not a place or a time but a feeling, the feeling of being in a space that was genuinely yours, doing work that genuinely mattered, surrounded by people who knew your name and meant it when they used it. She had not expected to find that in Montana. She had not expected to find it at all, if she was honest, because the version of herself that had gotten on that bus had mostly stopped expecting things, on the grounds that expectations were a form of vulnerability she couldn't afford. But it was here. It was real. It had the solidity of good pine and reseated cast iron, and a water allocation that had been defended in a county court, and an 18-month renegotiated banknote, and a child's drawing pinned to the wall that said home in careful handwriting. It was not perfect. It would not be. The fence on the north pasture would always need looking at. The stove would develop new issues. The route would have bad weeks. She and Cole would disagree about things they already did. With the plain-spoken friction of two strong-headed people who respected each other enough to argue honestly rather than smooth things over and let the tension go underground where it got worse. That was fine. That was what it was supposed to look like. She pulled the loaves from the oven and tapped the bottom of each one the hollow sound that meant done, all the way through, and set them on the rack to cool. Outside the wind came down from the ridge, the way it always did. Kitchen held against it, the way it always did now. Elena stood in the warmth of her own making and listened to her daughter because that was what Lily was becoming. In the slow, unofficial, unannounced way that the most real things become real hum, something tuneless and contented on her stool, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing you were looking for, not the arrival of it. The daily fact of it, imperfect and recurring and entirely irreversibly yours. She picked up her pencil and started the next week's supply list. There was always more work to do. That, she had come to understand, was not a burden. That was the point.